Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories podcast. I'm your host, John Dehlin. It is March 3rd, 2025, and I could not be more excited for today's episode. Today, we have in the house someone who's known globally by hundreds of thousands, if not millions, I'm guessing millions of people, but he might be a new name to many or most of my audience because his expertise is a little bit niche or not so niche, depending on who you are. But today we have with us Danny Rensch. He is the author of a brand new book called Dark Squares, How Chess Saved My Life. But Danny Rensch is also one of the co-founders of chess.com. I think he's the chief chess officer. He's an international master in chess, which means his rating, at least at one point, was what, over 2,600 or something like that?
Around there, 2,500.
2,500?
Yeah.
I'm new to a lot of this stuff, but I just read his book. I've read a lot of cult memoirs. You know, you guys know Tara Westover, Amber Scora, the list goes on, but this is a phenomenal cult memoir. I hope you don't mind me calling it that,
You
Danny.
can call it whatever you want.
Okay.
It makes sense, yeah.
And it's coming out, I believe, the week that this episode is going to air.
Yeah.
And so I want everyone to go buy this book and help make it an international bestseller. It absolutely, I was showing Danny beforehand, like every single page is marked with copious notes. And I love the stuff. So you're going to love the book. It's also got a lot about chess. We're also welcoming, to the extent that the broader global chess community is joining us today on Mormon Stories. Mormon Stories is a 20-year-old podcast that I set up as an excommunicated Mormon. Actually, I was believing at the time I set it up, and then the church excommunicated me for the podcast 10 years later. But the purpose of Mormon Stories is to provide stories that support people who are in a faith journey, particularly those who have experienced a faith crisis and are trying to find healing and support in their journey. Danny, you might be interested to know, I think I may have mentioned this to you before, that over half of our audience now has never been Mormon. But most importantly, I am very, very confident that those of you who are interested in cults, high demand religions, or just trauma, addiction, relationships, healing, growth, are going to love today's story. So without any further ado, Danny Rensch, welcome to Mormon Stories podcast.
Thank you for having me. That was quite the intro, and I'm thrilled to be here, and appreciate the notes. I wonder how many of them we can get into, because I looked at the book too. It had a lot of notes there, so I can't wait to hear what you think. And again, thanks for having me.
No, I love it. Yeah, and a couple other coincidences. So several years ago, when I first found chess.com, I created an account and logged on, didn't know anything about, who owned it or who didn't. And at some point, this guy named Eric reaches out to me, thanks me for Mormon Stories. And I think he gave me a diamond account, which was super cool at the time. Yeah. I'm like, whoa, I could do all the things for free. Like, this is amazing. Eric Allebest, it turns out, who is also one of the co-founders of chess.com, is the husband, is married to Amy Allebest, who we've had on Mormon Stories now several times, the founder of Breaking Down Patriarchy. So, and now Amy and Eric have moved back to the Salt Lake area. You, Danny, have moved here. So that's another connection we have. And then a final connection is I served a chunk of my Mormon mission in the Mesa, Gilbert, Chandler, Tempe area, which it turns out is primarily where you grew up.
Probably close to where I was born. You might have come to the house that I was born in, given
possible.
that at one point the collective, the cult that I was in, occupied a number of homes right there on 7th Street.
Yeah.
So anyway, who knows?
Yeah. All right. Well, I read your whole book. I just finished it today, actually, and I'm super excited to dig in. Any disclaimers you want to provide, or any intentions you want to share at the outset before we just dig right in?
That's a great question. Never been asked that before at the start of a podcast. I don't think so. I'm excited to hear what questions you might have and what thoughts you might have about the particular group you mentioned quickly at the outset, in terms of the purpose of the podcast, helping people in their faith journey and helping them maybe find their way through an experience that is either traumatic and or in a high demand group, right? And the definition of those types of groups can kind of vary based on how people feel about that stuff. So I'm, didn't necessarily plan on even writing a memoir, didn't know where this journey was going to take me initially, but I feel now on the road and confident that that it's leading to a lot of really healthy conversation, and I hope that this conversation is one that also can help people in any way possible. So,
yeah,
so let's go.
All right, let's do it. Okay, so traditionally, when I bring someone on to talk about a cult that they're probably not familiar with, or even if they are, I start by maybe giving a background about the cult itself. So the church that we're going to be talking about today, or the cult, is called the Church of Immortal Consciousness. And it was never a super large church, even at its highest point, 200 members?
Maybe 300.
300 members, yeah.
Depending on whether being a member was fully defined as living in Tonto Village, Arizona, which is a northern Arizona suburb right outside of Payson, Arizona. Depending on the definition of it, I would say maybe 300 at its peak.
Yeah, but still a significant cult nonetheless. So what I thought would be cool would be to back up a little bit and talk about kind of the culture that Trina and Steve Camp, the founders of the Church of Immortal Consciousness, kind of were swimming in, maybe along with your dad and mom. Because that, I've attended Landmark Forum. I attended it once. I've learned about EST a little bit. EST.
Yeah.
And it turns out that even, as I understand it, Scientology was influenced by the same sorts of things that influence EST and Landmark. So there's this kind of milieu of like late 60s, early 70s that seems to have been the breeding grounds for all sorts of stuff, including Charles Manson. So do you want to talk about what you even have learned about EST and Landmark, and then have that segue into Trina and Steve Camp's story, and then we can bring your parents into that next, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I can speak to what I know about these groups. I guess one of the things that happened naturally during this process that is both kind of my own self-reflection about my life, and then also the edification that came from expanding my own self-reflective journey on how did this happen? How did we get here? What principles that I was raised on in the collective came from other places, and or might even be like, things that sound good and make sense, but were misused in that particular power dynamic, right? And I think, so to share that experience, I would
just
say
to warn people, when he says the collective, he means that's what they called the
collective,
group, the church,
So
it's collective with a capital C.
Thank you for saying that, right? It's obviously one of those things where when you're talking about something that's so close to you, you have your own blind spots on the terminology that isn't appreciated. But so the collective, I grew up referring to it often as just the family, which was another term. The collective certainly did not self-identify as a cult.
No one does.
Yeah, no one does. But the collective that I grew up in had a number of different teachings, and of course we're going to get into probably a lot of that today, whatever we decide to. But a lot of the teachings of EST and or the Landmark Forum came from, there was a movement around that time. And again, I can't speak to all of it because it wasn't my experience. I wasn't even born yet. But I do know that both Stephen and Trina Camp and my parents, Steve Rensch and Debbie Sampson, were involved in different groups, including rebirthing. Rebirthing was a process where people acknowledge that or embrace the idea that the most traumatic experience you have in your life is actually when you're born and you come into the world, and that if you can rewrite kind of the story of that you might have trauma release. So there was a rebirthing community, the S community.
Well, wait, you can't just jump over that, because as I understand it, adults would sit in a bathtub full of water to emulate a rebirth. Is that right?
Yes, from what I understand. And I have never been rebirthed, so I know that it is a thing that different people have done at different times. I don't know whether everyone was always kind of naked in a bath or if there was some other code to that, but generally the idea was to try to relive that experience, to rewrite, your neurosynapses and your sort of emotional stories where possible, to have a better experience of coming into the world. That was one thing that was going on.
And Steve was a rebirther.
My dad was a certified rebirther.
I meant met the other Steve?
So that's the funny
There's
thing.
two
So just to
Steves. This is
clarify for the
confusing.
audience now, there are two Steves in the story. There is Stephen Camp, who was the main leader, the founder of the collective, along with Trina Camp. And then Steve Rensch is my father. But I grew up calling Stephen Uncle Stephen, or eventually Grandpa. So when I refer to him, I will say Stephen.
Okay, that's
when I
Camp.
say Steve, it'll be my father,
Got it.
just because that's
Okay.
kind of how they're known.
So who was was it Stephen or
They
Steve?
both were. They were both certified rebirthers, from what I know.
Okay.
And anyway, so EST itself is something that was started by Werner Erhard. Eventually, I don't even know what EST stood for. I apparently it was Erhard's Seminar Training. I've also heard it was Extreme Spiritual Training. I don't know what it really was stood for, but EST was a group of that. You know, there were a lot of things about that group that were about taking responsibility for your own life, appreciating the aspects of the world and existence that are meaningless so that you can rewrite your own meaning, and in some ways empowering yourself through a different perspective of what has happened to you versus the stories you've told yourself. A lot of that stuff is good. I mean, I, for one, often quote Carl Jung's, "We are not what happens to us. We are the stories we tell ourselves. We are what we choose to become," right? I believe in that to the best degree I can, and I think it can be very empowering. Where and how that can be used and misused is something we'll get into, right? But there was a lot of those types of practices, I guess, and those things were taken into the founding of the collective, but a lot of that came about because Stephen and Trina met not necessarily just because of the rebirthing community and because of the EST community, which eventually became the Landmark Forum, but also because Trina Camp was a trance medium. And Trina Camp,
Tell us what that is.
What she did was she tranced a spirit known as Dr. Durran. And at this point in the 70s, she was traveling a lot around the world and trancing for different groups in different seminars. This was what she did. And you know, we can talk about the process of trance and what that experience was, but essentially her and Stephen met at a group where she was doing a trance circle, which is what they were called, where she would sit in a chair in a room with people, often formed in a circle, and at some point when the lights were dim, she would engage in a channeling process where her voice changed and it was no longer her speaking, it was the voice of Dr. Durran, and he would give a sermon, he might answer questions. This process was one that she had been doing for actually many years before she met Stephen Camp. But
always with Durran, or
always with she did. From what I know, she also tranced other spirits at different times. She would describe herself as a medium. Her job was to sort of be an open vessel to spirits who might want to come through and deliver messages. But over time, the relationship between her and Durran, as she would say, became the one that was the most. That was what her job became, was trancing Dr. Durran all the time.
And what was his, I'll say, alleged background historically? Yeah. And also, do we know if someone named Durran actually existed?
I have never done that research.
Okay, interesting.
Maybe with this book coming out and the story, maybe there'll be some people who do. I actually don't know whether there is a confirmation of whether Dr. Durran ever existed as a person, but the story was that Durran was a doctor in the 15th century in England, and that he actually went to, again, I'm going to misquote because I don't know what the official names of schools are, some sort of official university in England to become a medical doctor. When he eventually passed, he was given different teachings and trained by Moses on the astral. This was the story, was that Moses was his teacher.
After he died.
After he died.
Oh.
And that a lot of what he learned as a spiritual teacher came directly from the teachings of Moses.
Oh.
And Dr. Durran, as he would be tranced through Trina, had messages, had a teaching, had a framework for his followers in terms of how to be the highest versions of their own soul. And so it's funny, every time I do one of these podcasts, I feel like they start differently, and you start explaining things in a way that I haven't quite explained before. So this is fun. So I'm just going to take a breath for a second.
It's fun for me too. Like, this stuff isn't in the book, by the way. This
So again, to take a step back, there is and are the groups of different types of what you would call occult belief systems developing in the 60s and 70s. Of course, there were all kinds of non-denominational, non-traditional religious and spiritual beliefs happening. We talked about rebirthing, which I don't even know if it would call itself a religion or spiritual belief. It was a thing
Practice.
that was happening. And then we talked about Est and eventually the Landmark Forum. The idea that Trina is traveling and trancing. And again, back to Dr. Durran, his life as it came to an end in the 15th century, and then his training on the astral plane became one where he eventually was trancing through Trina, or he was speaking through Trina camp. And she has shared this story publicly. There are actually videos of her having tranced on national television and otherwise. Some of them will probably be resurfacing more and more with this story as it comes out. But that process of her trancing was something that had been happening. She met Stephen Camp at a trance circle in Southern California, and I share about their story of kind of how they came together in the book, but ultimately they decided eventually that rather than her continuing to travel, that they would set up shop in Mesa, Arizona, and invite people to come here to Durran by visiting them rather than them traveling. And that was the quickest version, knowing you can see how my brain is working. There are obviously a number of different sub-bullets, but I will do my best to pause when I can and let you ask more questions. But essentially, Stephen and Trina Camp met during a trance circle. Stephen Camp was a certified rebirther and a well-known person within this sort of larger community, as was my father, actually. And while the collective was founded by Stephen and Trina, my parents were then two of the earliest members, I guess, adopters. They eventually moved to Mesa along with a lot of the other kind of founding members of the group. And the group was setting up shop on East 7th Street right there in Mesa, Arizona. And that was how the collective was formed.
And you call Camp Uncle Stephen, right?
I grew up calling him Uncle Stephen.
Okay. So Uncle Stephen, his quick bio, wasn't he a professional, like a white collar professional before, or was that your dad?
No, that was my dad.
Okay. Do you know Stephen Camp's background before he met Trina?
He was kind of a wayward traveler. He was born in upstate New York and eventually made his way kind of into Berkeley around the 60s and was
educated, not educated?
He went to Syracuse.
Okay, yeah. Okay.
I would describe him as educated. And again, I know he went to college and I think he dropped out, but eventually made his way to Berkeley and was kind of a part of a lot of things that went down in Berkeley around the 60s and 70s. And that's probably the quickest version of that. My dad was an attorney in Southern California for several years before him and my mom moved to the collective in Mesa.
Okay. So really quickly in the book, it becomes clear that by the time you're being raised in the collective, the words of Durran as channeled through Trina are synonymous with the will of God. And so I'm wondering, I don't know if theology is the right way to describe it, but kind of in the theology of the Church of Immortal Consciousness or in the collective, how were God and Durran connected in terms of Durran channeling literally the mind and will of God? Or was there a theology about that? It's
interesting because I would say yes to what you're saying and not 100% in terms of how it was presented or how the active members of the church related to it. Because one of the core premise of Durran's teaching was the concept of reincarnation. And so reincarnation, not necessarily as it's understood or believed in the Hindu belief system or other types of what I'd describe as sort of casting systems that can have their own sort of hierarchy and be their own sort of high demand, high control type of experience. What I'm saying there is that a lot of, without casting any dispersions, I would say a lot of the framework of certain reincarnation beliefs can be that if you messed up in the last lifetime, that's why you're this lifetime, right? So if you think about what that actually means in practice, it means that the moment you're born, you are already cast and sort of placed within the broader hierarchical system of where you belong, right? And it's because you're reaping the karma or the sins of your previous life, right? So if you continue to do the math on that, that means that maybe everybody who's rich deserves and has sort of the the card to kind of mistreat people who are lower than them in the caste system, right? So it's not a great way to think about reincarnation. in my opinion. Durran's perspective on reincarnation was one that there is no moving backwards. There was only moving forwards. You can stay stuck at your current level of understanding, but reincarnation is not a system used to judge others. It was a system to evolve toward your highest self eventually. And so what Durran would say is that his teaching is something that was coming from him, which is that of someone who lived in the 15th century and someone who is a student of Moses, but it is not the ultimate word of God. You have your own path to God. Everyone is moving in their own way toward their highest consciousness self. I am here as a teacher. I am here to provide you with lessons and or help you on that journey if you want it, but I'm not here to break your free will. I am not here to do anything more than what you want to engage with. Now, again, there are all types of dynamics about the collective that we're going to get into, right? And ways that was maybe said, but not necessarily felt or practiced, right? And so you get a lot of very confusing power dynamics when you have a deity in Trina trancing a spirit in Durran, and a hierarchy within the collective that allows Trina and Stephen to essentially make decisions for everyone, right? And sometimes those decisions are used under the auspices or ordainment of Durran, and no one really knows whether it ever came or not. And then you have Durran speaking through Trina, but that message can be weird in terms of whether, was it Trina's opinion that influenced that? Was this actually something that feels good to me because I'm told I am in charge of my own journey to God? So I guess what I'm saying at the start is it's obviously very confusing. And as a member of the collective who's been in therapy for almost 10 years and continues to work on all of his own grief and trauma and make sense of it for myself, I think, like many people who were in the collective, continue to try to make sense of it for my own self in terms of what do I feel was the baby versus the bathwater, right? To use an analogy that I've said a few times, even though it's a crass one in some ways. No. It's I think a lot of people, when they go through those experiences of challenging their own faith or embracing skepticism while also trying to keep parts of something that feels good to them and actually does speak to their highest self, for lack of a better way to put it. Yeah. I think that process can be a very painful one, right? Deconstructing it and then rebuilding what matters to you. So I'm acknowledging openly here that I might even be someone who is still in the process of doing that, right? Course. But I think I want to say that from where I view it, Durran's teaching, while misused and abused at a lot of different times, and there was a lot of confusion that a lot of people grew up with in terms of whether they even believed Durran was real or not, or whether they feel they had an experience the spirit was real, but actually can still acknowledge the opposing truth that it was a cult. Those anywhere in between, right? There's a lot of different versions of gray in between. I think that's a thing that a lot of people are still trying to unpack. But Durran, at its best, whether it is an entity or not, would say that it was there, or he was there to help other people have an experience, not necessarily to pretend that he is the end all be all of God. Because again, back to what I said at the beginning, reincarnation as a concept is supposed to be a self-empowering one in your spiritual evolution, not one that is operating with as much, it would like to think it's not operating with as much dogma as a traditional kind of Judeo-Christian framework. I think that's what he would say. Totally. If that makes sense.
Yeah. And this makes total sense. And the only reason I brought it up is because later, and we'll get to this, once you start working directly with Stephen Camp as kind of your mentor, he starts saying you need to become a world chess champion because that's what God wants for you. Yes. And so at some point, God clearly gets mixed in. Now, whether that's 100% Stephen Camp mixing it in, or Durran, or Trina, but that's why I asked the question.
Yeah, and I'm an unreliable narrator in some ways, right? Because I lived it. I'm traumatized by what happened, and also making the best sense I can of it, and all that stuff. So I guess I'm sorry if some of those answers are long-winded.
No, it's not at all. In fact, Mormonism has its own. I think religions and cults benefit from the ambiguity. So in Mormonism, was the Book of Mormon a translation? You mentioned you read the Book of Mormon at one point in the book. Was the Book of Mormon a translation of God? How much was Joseph Smith putting his own stuff in there versus it being a literal translation? When past prophets have spoken, when were they speaking as a man? When were they speaking as a prophet? All that stuff is in Mormonism and probably in all high demand religions. Yeah. And I think religions benefit from that flexibility if, like you say in the book, when the prophecy or the counsel is helpful, the cult always gets the credit. But when things go wrong, it's the member that always gets the blame. But having that flexibility as well, if the prophecy or the advice is good, well, that was God.
Yep.
That was the collective. But if it goes wrong, well, maybe it was Trina was having a bad day, or maybe Stephen Camp. It was, you know what I mean? That flexibility can be helpful. Anyway, I'm loving this all the way so far. So really quickly, did you call Trina a deity? Did I get that right?
Well, I sort of was using it as an example of how people would kind of understand this stuff. She was the She was the boss, whatever you want to say, the deity, the guru, the boss of.
She was the one with special powers.
She was
in
the
your
one,
life, right?
Who was trancing Durran, whether you believed in it or not, right? She was sort of the reason the collective came together, was because people moved there to hear Durran.
Yeah.
Right, and ultimately, Trina herself was a very magnetic person. You know, very very charming and likable, and so I think sometimes when I'm explaining the broader kind of what is the framework, what is the infrastructure, so that as we dive into the conversation, people have context. I was sort of trying to explain that while I would say in many ways the collective was very much a patriarchy posing as a matriarchy, I think that she was the front person in a way that served how the machine worked in a lot of ways, and we'll talk about that. But undeniably, too, the reason people came to the collective was inherently to hear Durran, at least for most people, right? And if Durran was real or not, whether they enjoyed the teachings or not, that came from Trina, which made her kind of the most important figure, right?
Yeah, no, it's kind of like the Mormon Church would say it's all about Jesus, but Joseph Smith was the way we learn about the true Jesus. So in some ways, Joseph Smith historically has been elevated as the most important part of Mormonism, even though the church would downplay that and say, no, it's all about Jesus. Yeah. There's so many parallels. But all right, fun. So Trina is kind of the spiritual prophetess, I'm going to say my words, and her husband, Stephen Camp, is kind of the businessman, but also a guide as sorts as well. Is that right? He's kind of an operations guy, but also he's given a lot of wisdom. He's helping a lot of people as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, so Stephen Camp, in addition to being Trina Camp's husband and sort of operational partner, was a certified rebirther, which regardless of judging the process or not, there was something that went into that understanding of kind of the traumas around, you know, early childhood pain and stuff. He was also a certified S trainer, which again is someone who, I guess I don't know what all the hierarchy or steps to become that, but it is someone who knew the landmark forum inside and out from that point of view. And
he had a background in self-improvement.
Yeah, and had a background, I think, in psychology actually and self-improvement.
Yeah.
And so he understood, I mean, I would categorize or describe Stephen Camp as brilliant when it comes to understanding the human condition and things that make people tick and what they look for and what they desire. And again, as we get back into at his best, depending on where that person sat within the larger kind of goals he had for the collective, he probably gave some really, really great advice and provided some interesting support to people, right? And then at its worst, in terms of understanding the human condition, knowing how to leverage that and use that would be an understatement to say he knew how to do that. Yeah.
I think I read in the book that neither are alive today. Is that right? Or
Stephen Camp is alive, actually.
He is alive.
Yeah.
Okay.
Trina Camp passed away in December 22.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just a few years ago.
Yeah.
And do we know what? We'll get to that. Okay.
Yep.
So, all right. So maybe we talk about your parents now.
Yeah.
A little bit about what maybe. I mean, it's common for high demand religions to help people who are in distress. Maybe talk about whether or not your parents kind of fit that category.
For sure.
Whatever background you want to share, how they met, and then how their early family develops or dissolves.
It's funny because as I share in the book, I don't know a lot about their courtship kind of by design, right? As I'm going to get into in a second. Yeah. The twist ending is my parents' marriage didn't make it, everybody. And so when your relationship doesn't make it within the collective, it's not something that you're going to keep talking about for all the reasons we're going to get into, and how that was again weaponized and certainly passed on to me. But before we get into that, my parents were married when they moved to the collective. I know that they had been married for several years. They were in New York and then Southern California.
Again, you say lay law school, your dad?
My dad was a practicing attorney.
Okay.
At a pretty high powered firm in LA, actually. I don't remember the name, but he was doing well. And my mom was also educated, but had been bouncing around basically her entire life. She was an Army brat, lost both of her parents young. And so marrying my dad was kind of the opposite. He had stable home life and went to good schools and was practicing law in LA. They were married at the time. My dad was a practicing Buddhist before discovering rebirthing in Est and then ultimately moving to the collective. So my dad had his own very spiritual journey. He would describe it as finding himself to the collective and to Durran. Again, I've said many times, and this is funny because sometimes when I talk about it, I say again every time that I know limited information, partly because one, it was not told to me, and then also because then as I started to unpack it, they both told me different versions of the story, right? And I think that happens in divorces where, from what I understand, my mom was the one who wanted to move to the collective. Steve Rensch and Stephen Camp never quite got along really ever as far as the power dynamic goes, but they did move to the collective. And then ironically, despite the tensions between Stephen and Steve, because they're both kind of alpha male sort of warriors on their own spiritual, and they both have kind of their S training stuff, they kind of quickly became more or less partners as like kind of the top two men in the collective. And my mom didn't continue to rise up the totem pole in the way that my dad did. And so not long, I don't know exactly the timing, but it was within a couple of years, they were already on the verge of divorce. My dad decides that my mom has to have a baby or he's not going to stay with her. For whatever reason, my mom said yes to that, even though they were no longer having sex. And so she was, it was in vitro. I was inseminated, and ultimately born. And not long after being born, my dad officially divorced my mom and married the oldest daughter of Stephen and Trina Camp, which is where my story and mine and my mom's story sort of separated from my dad for the next 13 years until we get into what happened later. And so that's the fastest way to describe that my parents found their way, because my mom loved Durran. She heard Trina trance. She wanted more opportunities to hear Durran. They moved to the collective in Mesa, and ultimately their marriage did not make it. And I was born, and my dad divorced my mom. So I know that sounds like a weird bullet list to give, but that's kind of the bullet list to give.
No. And I want to talk about the way marriage was treated, and specifically the way wives are treated. Before we do that, you talk about a few of the theological or doctrinal pillars of the collective. You talk about processing. Is it called in resonance? What is it called with your partner in
like vibration?
Like vibration.
Like vibration.
Talk about a few. I had that in my notes, but I couldn't bring it up in memory. So talk about some of the core teachings or principles before we get into the way women were treated, wives were treated, basically.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, we're doing a study case here, right? So now my brain is summarizing where we're at. The collective is formed. My parents are there. There are some foundational things that the collective adhered to and or was regularly practicing or using in their language. So the first one was this concept. If we go back to what I said about Durran's teaching, and that reincarnation is a core principle. Karma is more of a spiritual law, in fact, than an opinion. What goes around comes around. You will reap what you sow, lifetime over lifetime. This is a fundamental belief, and that as you move closer to God, lifetime over lifetime, you move closer to your like vibration. Now, what is that? A like vibration is, if we believe that we all came from the center of the universe at some point, from the same place, and that at some point souls were dispersed everywhere, right? And they're living all over the different universes and timelines and planets. As you evolve back toward your best self, you will be on a similar frequency and vibration with others who are moving back toward the same center, the same oneness. It's kind of interesting from a spiritual theory, right? And depending on how you feel about where we all came from, we can't answer those questions. We'll get into the metaphysical later, right? But the idea was, hey, we all came from the same place. You've had many lifetimes as you've evolved and learned your lessons. And as you get closer to your final sort of soul evolution, you are with your like vibration soul group, which can be a number of people. And like vibration as a person can be the individual who's, like, lack of a better way to say it, is your soulmate. That's a good comparison people can relate to, right? So your like vibration is supposed to be your soulmate, because one of the final stages of becoming one with God is becoming one with another person. The idea that you learn how to compromise and have a healthy relationship can be a really healthy framework of how to be the best version of yourself, right? And so like vibration was a tool to say, hey, your like vibration is supposed to be your partner as you navigate everything in life, which means full chakra alignment, spiritual alignment, sexual alignment, alignment on what you're doing together is how you're going to move back toward God. So like vibration was a tool in Durran's teaching. So that's like vibration explained at its best before we talk about any of the ways it was misused, right? The other thing you quickly mentioned was the process. The process was... And
also the term out of integrity.
Yeah. Well, we'll get into all that stuff, right? So I wanted to explain, and again, I've obviously, done a lot of my own work on this, researched a lot. I share in my book that one of the things that, was on my own path was that I have read a lot of spiritual literature, and I did it on my own regard and also at the suggestion of Dr. Durran, ironically or not. And so we'll get into that. But I have a lot of my own. There's no way I can't describe it without having to acknowledge that I've come to understand, I think even for myself, what at its best the goal was. Whether you believe in it or not, this was the goal, right, of what it was maybe before it was misused. So when I explain it, I like to say, hey, this is the idea of what it was, right? And so that's like vibration. The process was in the collective, the process was multiple things. It was noun, adjective, and verb. And here's what I mean by that. Processes themselves were a thing that happened, which would essentially be group meetings, group therapy. Everybody would come together and discuss their issues, talk about things going on in their marriage, everything from as intimate as things going on in their bedroom to anything else they're struggling with. They would share their opinions and judgments on other couples and other things. And the processes were essentially group meetings overseen by the leaders of the collective, overseen by Stephen and Trina, eventually my dad and his wife Marlo, who's Stephen and Trina's oldest daughter. The processes were a place where people came together to talk, I'll say. Someone also had their own process. What that means is, like, this person's process is that they're struggling with X, Y, and Z. They're struggling with being out of integrity in their marriage and in their like vibration relationship. So that's the idea that someone could have their own process that they were working on. And then the other thing is someone could be processed, which is like a verb, like, hey, Danny was processed last night about his bad chess tournament. What would that mean? It would mean I was essentially in one of the group meetings and I was in the hot seat and everyone was kind of telling me why I was struggling or giving me their judgments. And that could be as crazy as some processes literally got physical and some processes were just what they were. They were just words and maybe even some people left feeling good, right? Depending on what happened, right? So again, that is the process that happened. People had a process that kind of belonged to them and you could be processed. And those were ways that the terms were used within our collective, right? So I've given you the context you're asking for, right? You want this, right?
Yeah,
This is fun for the audience, I guess.
And it reminds me of Landmark, because when I went to Landmark, sometimes the guide at Landmark would bring up someone to the microphone and they would give kind of tough feedback to the person. And then sometimes the audience would as well. And there was this whole dialectic of sort of tough feedback for the participant.
Well, I mean, we'll get into my own opinions on that if you want it. I think there are parts of that can be super healthy. I think where things can get really messed up is when the person giving the feedback also has an agenda and or motive for what you decide to do with the feedback. That is where it gets dangerous. And I've said this before, which in my opinion, John, and you'll have your own on this, is that where spirituality and religious frameworks can be healthy is encouraging people to ask tough questions and to reflect in big ways and all the things that come with the human experience, which is, why am I here? What is my purpose? What am I trying to do to feel good about my life? Helping people ask big questions, I would argue, is good. Pretending you have the answers is where any religion can become a cult.
Or manipulating people for your own
right.
ends,
So,
right?
but because it's both of the same thing, either pretending you have the answers or thinking you have the thing they should choose.
Yeah.
And I think the moment you cross those lines is like, people have done intense leadership seminars and coaching, and some of them are influenced by Landmark Forum and others are influenced by these types of things. But the moment the person has a reason to be motivated by what that person does with the feedback is where it can become dangerous. And the moment a religious or spiritual framework stops just encouraging people to reflect and starts telling them, I have all the answers for you, is where it gets dangerous. But okay, that's another question, right? So back to what was happening here was that like vibration is a tool. Processes are used to process people, to help them discover their shit, right? To help them get into the weeds and figure out what's going on with them. But you have it being overseen by people who are running the collective and are ultimately now aware of everyone's problems and able to and motivated in some ways to use it against them, depending on it.
It's like the auditing in
right. And it's not even just the leaders.
Right?
What you have is like everyone in the collective is sort of in the same battle of how they end up coming out of those processes. How do they look? How did they express themselves? How does it feel in terms of, you know, what they said versus what was said to them? How did they handle being on the hot seat? Because everyone had turns on the hot seat. So how did you handle that dynamic? And how did, you know, so that's the process. And then I would say the last like pillar, if I'm drawing a triangle of what kind of made up the collective, I would say the last pillar that we'll get into is purpose. And purpose was a big thing because purpose as a thing is something we all want to believe we have and want to search for in our life, and it is whatever. Purpose in the collective was usually a thing that you were actually like given or told like was your purpose, right? And so that could be as menial as like, your job is to do this, your job is to clean the houses or to fix the cars, or like, hey, your purpose is chess. And your entire reason for being on the planet is to become like the greatest chess player of all time, right? And so the idea that everyone has purpose, we are all moving back toward our higher self with a partner, a soulmate, and let's have really amazing group therapy where we help each other on the way. I just drew a really positive triangle, right?
Yeah.
Like great stuff, great stuff, right?
Yeah.
And then there's like, how was it actually used in practice and what happened? And it's interesting because when you talk about stuff, you said that people join these groups because they are searching for help, right? And or some are running away from their past. Maybe some are openly aware that they're running away, but they're looking for help. Maybe there's a bunch of area in between where people are less aware of their own shit and become sort of infatuated with this idea that they can grow within a hierarchy and they're going to take advantage of it as best they can. I would say that every single one of those things happened and many things that I'm not mentioning. But people who are smart, people who are good end up in these groups. It's not as simple as like, I've been asked by so many people like, well, when did you first realize you were in a cult and escape? It's like, well, that's like a really black and white way to say something, and how like you like in a Hollywood version have a moment of clarity and whatever, right? And like the reality is, just like good people end up in tough situations, it's not that easy to come to the clarity that you're even in one of those situations, even if you're born, let alone, I mean, maybe even harder because I was born in it, right? And so,
but your dad was attracted to it.
My dad was definitely attracted to it.
He was a successful attorney in L.A.
For sure, right?
And he wasn't a dummy. Attorney, he wasn't a naive dummy.
Exactly. And so,
well, it just smells, so many people come to me and say, John, how can so many super smart Mormons still believe? And my answer is, because belief isn't about intelligence. It's about other things. Do you want community, meaning, purpose, spirituality, connection? There are all sorts of reasons why. And it's more of a matter of what you need or what you value than your IQ.
Well said, right?
Yeah.
And I think, and also there's nothing, okay, there can be things that are wrong in ways that it's weaponized, but it's also good to acknowledge that there are things that feed the intellect and things that feed the soul, if you want to call it that, the emotional body, right? And I think that you nailed it, right? The reason people are in those situations, because the reason I started that rant, I guess, is because I was describing the positive ways to look at that triangle. Now, here are some ways that shit got ugly, right? And things broke down within that, right? We'll go back to like vibration first, which is to describe that the idea of having a soulmate, the idea of having a partner who challenges you, who makes you be the best version of yourself, is something that I certainly feel with my wife and partner and Shauna, and I love that part of our relationship, and it has not been easy making our marriage work, as I share a lot, and that's the truth, right? You work hard for this thing that you value, that you've committed to together. But if the idea that you have a like vibration ordained in all time and space becomes one where your marriage isn't working, so you go, instead of trying to make it work, you go, well, maybe this person isn't my like vibration. Maybe this much younger woman is.
Exactly.
Right? Or even if that it's not even a much younger woman, just any other woman is, right? As a guy, right? In this group where there's sort of not always carte blanche, but there is a clear path to being with someone else, right? You have a leader in Stephen Camp and Trina Camp. They're sort of overseeing everything. There's this process that is happening now over here where if you show up as like an alpha and perform well, you might be attractive to the women in the group because of your performance, right? And if your broader purpose is also one that is either lucrative to the collective and or just deemed valuable, now there's like an obvious framework where this whole idea that instead of making your marriage work and making your relationship feel like a like vibration relationship, you're essentially casting aside your partner to choose a better one. Now multiply that by like dozens of times, right? This is something that happened in the collective a lot. You had men leaving their wives for younger women. You had men leaving their wives for other women. You also had promiscuity by women too. And so I want to paint a clear picture that there was a dynamic where this was the game that was being played, right? And you had the process being used and weaponized, not just with information against people, but in terms of performance. And then, purpose itself could be anything from, well, doesn't it sound good to have an ordained purpose by like a spirit, but also if your purpose was essentially a low-level job used to like fulfill the need in a financially merged communist community, which by the way, one of the things we skipped right past was that the collective was completely financially merged. There were only a few bank accounts. Everything was ultimately overseen by Stephen and Trina Camp and sort of the leaders of the collective. And so then when you kind of unpack that framework, you go, okay, like there's a lot of shit that it could go wrong here, and it did. And and that's, I guess, some of the stuff that we explained in my book, and I'll shut up there and let you ask the next question.
And Mormonism starts out as a collective as well. It was called the United Order, where Joseph Smith had everything financially in common, but he controlled the purse strings, and all the polygamy stuff that emerges within a short amount of time within Mormonism is similar to the like vibration stuff. Really quickly, just a clarification, when someone would do their process, Durran could be involved. So it's not just processing in a group. You might have a spiritual being as a part
Durran
of
was
the process.
Actually rarely involved in process.
Okay.
Actually, that was actually a human run experiment.
So when
there were
Durran...
trances, I would say this, there were trances that could get heavy for sure. There were definitely trances where Durran might be more direct with someone about their issues or about something they're struggling with, but Durran never led processes like that.
Or was involved.
Okay,
no. So you could get personal direction or feedback from Durran, but that would be more of a during a trance session than a processing session.
Yes, and often Durran gave more direct feedback in smaller trances. They were called privates. You would have a private with Durran. So there was group trances that happened traditionally like every Sunday. There was a ritualistic aspect of everyone would come together, sing songs, the lights would go low, you would kind of wait for Trina to come in. Eventually, her voice would change to Durran's voice, and depending on the day, there might be a sermon. Depending on the day, he might just immediately open up for questions. Things like this happened, right? There were private trances where you could request to have a private with Durran. And sometimes a private would be just you and Trina trancing. Sometimes the private would be overseen by Stephen Camp or another minister. For a long time, I think privates were always overseen by a minister so that it wasn't just Durran and the person, which, I can see understanding that both ways, both from like, if Trina is trancing for people who are sort of like passing through the collective almost for like a safety reason, there was like, okay, someone else should be there because we don't know who this person is. And then there are times where the minister's interpretation of what Durran was saying was a big part of what came out of the private, right? The human minister in the private trance with someone kind of had say-so over what Durran really meant by what Durran said. So private trances would happen. Then there were also small groups that happened. But the process itself was more of a, honestly, I would actually frame the processes as something that was more inherited from Est and the Landmark Forum type of stuff, right? And made a part of how people grew within the collective more than it was totally like a Durran ordained thing.
Got it.
Yeah.
But the mind and will of Durran could be incorporated into a processing session.
Sure.
Okay.
For sure. Yeah.
All right. And there's always this question, again, I always tie it back to Mormonism just for my audience and because it helps me make sense of the pattern, right? But with Mormonism, there's always like this question of, did Joseph Smith really see God in Jesus? Did Joseph Smith really talk to an angel Moroni and get the golden plates and create the Book of Mormon? Or was it his own invention? And then there's also the sub question of, did he think he talked to God in Jesus, even if he didn't? Did he think he was channeling an ancient people in writing the Book of Mormon or not? But the common apologetic response to that sort of questioning in Mormonism is, it's kind of miraculous either way. And in Trina's case, if she was channeling a 15th century British dude who was wise, that's amazing. But if she was able to convince a pretty smart group of people that weekly she could communicate and extemporaneously had wise, smart things to say that helped people in the voice of a 15th century dude, it's kind of impressive either way. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, and I think that's there's been I've had a lot of my own ups and downs, new perspectives found. I mentioned kind of how you separate the baby with the bathwater and different versions of deconstructing my own experience with that. And I would say that, I think that having bounced pretty hard in my own journey at different times between, at one point I was probably fully an angry atheist and heartbroken person who was not necessarily interested in being convinced that anything was real. It was probably a short-lived for me versus like making sense of the practical reasons and the good, healthy reasons for me to find good and to do good. And whatever the metaphor is of, hatred is drinking poison and expecting other people to feel sick, right? And the reasons you have to kind of look for good and to try to unpack maybe what happened. I've certainly had an interpretation at times that was similar in terms of, regardless of the source for a second, I'm going to focus on what I believe, what makes me feel good or doesn't, what was used and abused my way, and then kind of rewrite my own story, rewrite my own neurosynapses literally, and kind of try to figure out what makes sense in a healthy way. And I think what you said is true. And again, I was never Mormon. I can't speak for you or anyone else who would answer that question. I can say for me that there was definitely an experience of, regardless of how I feel about spirit and the potential opposing truth, that, maybe consciousness can live outside the body. There's all kinds of theories about this. Some of them are really popular right now. Donald Hoffman was on Diary of a CEO. If you don't know what that, he was a lot of very interesting, progressive and edgy science on the proof of the mind's ability to maybe live outside the body and or whether we understand what could exist after life. So I'm not going to get into that, but I am going to say that if you're even open to the idea that consciousness, forget about spirits or even whatever, but if consciousness can live outside the body, there's probably a framework to believe that why not the consciousness of people who've died? Why not your own higher consciousness that maybe has had an experience before you were in the body? And what does that look like, right? And so as long as the teaching that is coming from this idea of consciousness is not inherently corrupting, abusing, or worsening my life, let me be open to considering what was good and what wasn't. And so before I even dove into rebuilding my own faith and deciding whether or not I did have an experience where spirit was sometimes real, and I could acknowledge that that doesn't necessarily mean that Trina Camp wasn't a fraud. I maybe did have an experience of some teachings that I find to be really profound, and I had direct experience of those teachings being misused and abused in my own life. I might even believe that there was something special on a spiritual level happening, but it was a fucking cult. It was a cult, full stop, right?
Abusive,
and so
yeah.
I think in people's anger and heartache, as they find their way through faith journeys, it can be easier to be black and white, to believe that it was either all good or it was all bad, rather than embracing the nuance of maybe there were some good things that were intended and then bad shit happened. But the real mind fuck is maybe there were people there who were actually trying to do bad, and the twist ending is twist on them. Some good things happened in weird ways. There's all kinds of interesting things, right? And I certainly share a little bit of my version of that, in that, you know, there were things that were objectively nobody would approve now. I would never let my kids go through what I went through. But here I am in a place in my life where if I wouldn't change the ending, do I really get to cherry pick the middle and the beginning too?
Yeah,
do you really get to do that? And how does that actually work as you come to make sense of your life? So I'm apologizing, sorry, not sorry for the rant, but to me, because I'm answering the question of like, I think what you said is true in terms of how people unpack their faith. I think in your own journey of like anger, heartache, making sense of things that maybe objectively were not okay, you might be tempted to move into the black and white lane. I have settled in a place where I actually do believe there were some spiritual experiences I had, and I can say that it was a cult, and I'm actually okay with that. And I think both those things can live and be true. And so that is where I've landed on that. And I obviously will cut short there because there's been a lot of things that have gotten me there in my own journey. But it's a tough one, right? And yeah,
love it. I mean, that I was planning on maybe getting to that at the very end, but I'm really glad we hit it now because, I mean, we're talking about Durran, we're talking about Trina, and it's really powerful stuff. So I'm glad we have already.
And I don't mind getting to the end and whatever. No. But So back
to the like vibration thing. We were just starting with your mom and your dad's story.
Yeah.
So now apply that corrupt like vibration. Well, that corruptible. Like vibration doctrine to your parents in the first couple of years of their time together, right?
Yeah, and this is super tough because one of the things I'll share is that what I have come to understand and now know, not even my own interpretation, or I'll say I know based on the amount of people who've confirmed this to me. As you become an adult, you learn what was really going on and different things. What I now understand about what happened was not what was told to me for years, right? And so what happened was my dad grew very quickly within the collective and became the number 2 to Stephen Camp, the person who probably led more processes than anybody. He was really on the front lines of those parts of the collective. And I would argue that my dad never saw for years how he was being used in that framework as the guy who was willing to say all the really inappropriate shit and bust people up. And then Stephen Camp got to be the good guy who cleaned up in the background. But it doesn't matter because my father was not a victim and he chose to do that and ultimately probably did it and only did it because he was getting something out of it. No one does anything in life without some sort of payoff, right? To use the forum language, right? And so my dad was obviously leading those processes for a reason. And as he accelerated himself within the eyes of Stephen and Trina and Durran, my dad acted in all kinds of bad ways. He had an affair on my mom while they were married, and that young girl is my half sister from a one night stand in the collective. My dad ultimately left my mom and decided that Marlo, who was 19 at the time, my dad was 38,
and Stephen Camp's daughter.
And Stephen Camp, well,
right?
not biological because Stephen Camp had no biological children.
But
she was Trina Camp's daughter.
Trina Camp's biological daughter.
Yes. It doesn't really matter, but I'm just clarifying it for now.
Like his stepdaughter.
Yes.
Stephen Camp's stepdaughter.
Yes. And so my dad leaves my mom and marries Marlo. My dad is 38 and she's 19.
And you were how old at the time?
I was a 6-week-old baby.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a lot. They're only, a year here, a year in Mesa?
Yeah, somewhere between a year and 2 years, yeah.
And your dad becomes the number 2 guy, decides that your mom isn't his like vibration, but also it would make every sense for some sort of dynastic relationship for the number 2 guy to marry the number 1 guy's daughter or stepdaughter. You know what I mean? Not
only that, what I have come to learn, like I said, the context I gave right before the answer was that this was sort of positioned and proposed as like this really spiritual thing that happened, but I would learn many years later that this relationship between Steve Rensch and Marlo was basically put together by Trina Camp in like a drunken process one night. We haven't talked about alcohol yet because I described the pillars of purpose, like vibration, and the process. What I didn't talk about is that the group of people were a bunch of very wounded human beings wounding each other with alcohol dumped all over them. And this was something that was happening all the time. And people were drunk. Alcohol was encouraged. It was seen as a truth serum. Trina Camp herself I don't think I'm breaking any news in saying that she was a raging alcoholic, and part of that was why alcohol was so endorsed. And so I would learn later that Trina basically endorsed and or put my dad and her daughter together at a process where she was drunk and my mom had already gone to bed. Now, apparently they didn't get together that night, but ultimately the seed was planted, and eventually my dad would be marrying Marlo as a high-powered lawyer who was making money with the oldest daughter. And
your dad was in his 30s. She was, you said 18.
My dad was 38 and she was 19.
Interestingly, people think of Mormons now as not being alcohol drinkers. In the early years of the church, alcohol was heavily involved in people's spiritual experiences. So
that's interesting. I didn't know that.
That does track. Yeah. Joseph Smith drank until his very last day on the earth.
Oh, yeah, I didn't know that.
People don't know that. Yeah.
So that happened, and
so your mom gets kind of thrown away.
Yeah, my mom is sort of again cast aside or made lower on the totem pole. There was a literal totem pole within the collective. That was kind of what it was referred to as where you sat on the totem pole, and how people treated each other at times was reflective of how they felt about the other person's position within the broader kind of hierarchy. And
didn't y'all move away, you and your mom?
So I was a baby at this time. My dad is now with Marlo, and over the next couple of years, my mom would have my younger brother Josh with a man who was really only in the collective for it was basically a one-night stand. And then my mom would eventually remarry a man named Dennis who came to the collective.
Mechanic, right?
So Dennis is my stepfather. Debbie is my mother. At the age of somewhere between 4 and 5, the tensions between my mom and Marlo, who's a young wife to Steve Rensch, from what I've been told, were at their peak. The peak tensions. In fact, the woman my dad had an affair with, her name was also Debbie. And so there has been literally a term in the collective, the Debbie and Debbie days, the Debbie and Debbie karma. Literally, the Debbie and Debbie karma, the Debbie and Debbie days were an actual thing. And at this time, it was kind of like, hey, we need you to take a break and not be in the collective for a while so that you're not kind of front and center to Marlo and Steve's relationship. Sorry.
And I was just certain reading the book that your mom's going to take you, leave, and never come back. But that's not what happens. Not just with your mom, but with other people too. You could be totally shamed or damaged and somehow eventually find your way back. Right?
One of the things I've come to learn about these groups that has a lot of similarities is that what you think would normally be enough evidence or enough of an experience for people to say, okay, I'm done, is often the exact opposite thing that happens. Mm-hmm. And that the more times you can get someone to sign a covert contract that they don't even know they're signing, the harder it is for them to break it. And this is an actual behavior and a manipulation thing that I've come to learn was, I think for many years, I denied that it was premeditated or deliberate. I've now come to the idea that it most certainly probably was, and that when someone has to re-prostrate themselves at the feet, when they have to consistently re-adorn themselves, like I said, recommit to the values of a dysfunctional situation, they're both writing a covert contract that they're committed, but they're also kind of writing a covert contract to sort of participate in the process, right? And when you think about the broader collective, Stephen and Trina were kind of everyone's parents to a certain degree. And so that dynamic means that everybody is kind of a child to some degree to what they think of them, to what the parents of Stephen and Trina think. And so what happens is when you are sort of shunned as a child, you don't stop loving the person shunning you, you stop loving yourself. When you're an abused kid, you don't stop loving your abuser. You stop loving yourself because that is the safest thing to do.
Or spouse, right?
Or a spouse, right? Yeah. And again, I'm not a therapist, and I'm not going to pretend to talk about what happens fully. But I have been in therapy for a long time, and I've looked into a lot of this stuff, and of course been to hell and back in terms of my own trauma. And I have come to truly feel and integrate what this process looks like because I did it.
Yeah.
Which is that when I was abused and I was hurt, I didn't start doubting the person who was hurting me. I started doubting myself. This is why a lot of people, I think, avoid skepticism for a long time too, because the moment you open up that thread, it's also full of a lot of self-shame and self-doubt. Because when you're when you're in a position to question whether something happening to you is right or okay, that's a very scary thing to do, especially when you are actually a child, because it's easier to believe that you did wrong, that you deserved the abuse, and that it's all your fault, because that means you are still safe with the person who's abusing you. And that sounds simple, and like people understand this in marriage dynamics, or when a parent is actually physically, or emotionally, mentally abusive. But in the broader settings of the collective, that was literally what was happening. And so when someone is shunned and told they need to sort of show that they're committed and show that the teaching of Durran is still for them and that the collective still belongs to them, they are actually more likely to come back even more loyal and even more motivated to prove it than they are to say, I'm done with this place. And so that's exactly what happened to my mom at the age of 5 for me, and however old she was probably 41. I guess if I'm thinking she was 36, I think, when I was born. Something like that. We were demerged from the collective. That was the term. You were demerged from the group. And we moved to Colorado with Debbie and Dennis, my younger brother, Josh. Another family came with us, Elaine and her girls moved with us. She was also demerged because she was also the other woman in a different relationship that was happening. And it's not my story or experience, so I will not tell that, but that was kind of what happened with her life. So we were all in Colorado together. And for about a year, we lived there. And at some point, Stephen and Trina kind of started pulling them back in, saying, hey, Marlo's calmed down. You can come back now, these sort of things. And what's funny is what I've learned about that time is that my mom, despite everything I just described about what actually happens in those dynamics, where my mom really was a child to Stephen and Trina, who was being abused and shunned. And often what happens in those cases is you recommit yourself to get the parents' love, just like an abused child does. My mom actually, from what I've heard, was actually kind of like, fuck yourself. I'm actually not going back, from what I understand. She was actually more aggressive, but her marriage with Dennis was very young. And again, I'm speaking in hearsay a little bit, but from what I've heard, Dennis was ultimately convinced to come back, which made my mom convinced to come back, which made the whole thing happen in like a much more committed way. Now, my mom, again, for many years would say that Stephen and Trina were her teachers and she loved Durran and that's why she came back. But I've also heard that part of the story that maybe there was some moment where she did question it and she didn't want to. But either way, we did come back.
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess I'll slow down there because I'm giving a lot of information to let you guide the convo. But yeah, I think that just to summarize one more time, I think that dynamic surprises people when they hear about it, but it's actually not very surprising if you've been an abused person or suffered in any way from that type of trauma. That is what happens often in those power relationships. That is a very difficult thing for people who aren't abused to kind of unpack and understand.
Yeah, like the term that I became familiar with studying cult literature is called blame reversal, but it started to emerge in the 19th century when, like Jehovah's Witness movement, the leaders would predict a year for the return of Christ, and then the year would come and go and Christ wouldn't come. What the leaders would do is they would blame the followers for not being righteous enough, and they would end up believing more than less, even though the prophecy didn't come true. That's blame reversal. And in the case of the Mormon Church, some of the top founders of the church, Oliver Cowdery and Martin Harris, two good examples, they were excommunicated within the first 6 or 7 years of the church's existence. And the church always reminds people, but they came back. But what you're talking to us about really helps to fill in the pieces about why some of these people who experienced really horrible things ended up coming back. But the final thing that I'm hearing from you also is that conversion and deconversion is so often a social thing. And so it's not just simply what did you experience, what do you think and feel. Once you have spouses and children and extended family involved,
for sure,
there's so many more dynamics that bind you to the organization than just literally your own experiences and or what you actually believe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you nailed it. I think there's, these dynamics probably go back a little bit to what I was saying is where spiritual frameworks can be healthy because they help people ask questions, but how often are you actually really doing that with no agenda to what choice they make with the inner wisdom they decide to come to? Because everyone does have their own inner wisdom, their own intuition. Doing that can be okay, but then saying, okay, well, I asked those questions, but I know the answers and this is the only way. And now I'm even going to ask those questions in a way where I already know you're going to come to the answer. And I'm just planting the seed, right? Of recommitting yourself to the church. And, this happened a lot because you touched on the social groups and the family dynamics. I think as the collective at its peak started to have people leave for different reasons. One of the things I witnessed often, and I didn't understand it till many years later, was that rather than Stephen Camp, for example, talking to a daughter or a son of a parent who left the collective, because this happened often as people who were in the collective had children my age and our generation started to come of age and be young adults, there were often times where the parent left first. The parent would leave the collective and leave their now adult child who might be married, might be in their own group. They would leave them in the church even though they came to the perspective that this wasn't okay. And the way that was often handled in the process or in Stephen Camp's communication with the people who were still in the collective was never with like an outright, I love you, I hope you don't leave too. That would be too direct. It would actually be, so usually when someone leaves, one of the kids goes with them. Are you going to be the kid or you think it's going to be your brother? That's actually how it would go. So now you would have the person saying, well, no, I'm definitely not going to leave. That's definitely not going to be me, right? And even if it wasn't to create tension between the siblings that were still there, or is it going to be your sister or your brother, it would be, well, your mom has left and kind of disavowed the teaching, which once you know that this teaching is the highest, that's an even higher sin than not never knowing. And so if they've left, are you going to leave the teaching too? Or are you not going to leave the teaching? And it was always posed as a question because, again, a question is much more powerful in getting someone to re-sign the covert contract rather than saying with an actual heartfelt response or meaning like, I love you. I know you're going through a tough time. This has probably got to be hard for you. Like that's a healthy thing to say to someone who's struggling with their parent who's left the collective. Instead of saying, I love you. I know this is probably painful for you. I'm here for you. Yeah. It's, are you going to leave the teaching too, or are you going to not do that? Because we never know what's going to happen, right? And so you consistently create this dynamic where people are recommitting to the thing, regardless of whether, this is the cult dynamic as it was run in the infrastructure, regardless of whether, as we've already said, there were some good teachings or not are irrelevant at this point. The spiritual part of it that can be healthy for you has nothing to do with the framework that is being used to keep people there, if that makes sense.
Totally. Makes all the sense in the world. Yeah, so that constant recommitment. But also it's kind of reverse psychology. Yeah. Are you going to be the one that leaves? I'm not going to be the one that leaves.
Yep.
It's kind of insidiously brilliant in a way.
Yep.
Okay, so you and your mom and stepdad leave for a while, but then you come back.
Yeah.
Maybe we could start talking about how you got interested in chess. Is that at the very beginning? Is that worth going there? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Is that too abrupt of a segue, or is that okay?
No, that's great. Okay. And you're in charge, by the way. I'm just trying to tell the story and give you all the things that you're looking for. So we came back. At this point, the collective was still living on the block in Mesa, but very quickly relocated to Tonto Village. Tonto Village is a suburb in northern Arizona, just outside of Payson, and that was where the collective would sort of set up shop for the many years to come. And so I remember being 5 years old and hitting the village for the first time and being like, this is freaking awesome. These are all my friends I knew from a couple of years ago, right? And now I get to see them again, and we're living in the village and moved back from Colorado. Whatever would happen over the next 5 years, I was a kid in the village like anyone else, and a lot of that's in the book, but it's
kind of free range.
I'm free range, right? Yeah. And again, a lot of kids growing up in the village, had a great time. It was a close-knit community. You're in the forest all day playing, and there wasn't really much about my childhood in that way before I learned how to play chess that I would say was that painful. I didn't even know Steve Rensch was my father. I didn't really know much about anything in regards to my parents' dynamic.
But that's crazy. They kept
which is so crazy by itself, right?
Yeah.
The only reason I learned that Steve was my dad was because my half sister Trina, Stephen Marlowe's oldest child, said that she had a crush on me. And this is when I was 7 turning 8. So it was like, hey, he's been back in the village now for a couple of years from Colorado. We should probably make sure he knows that Steve Rensch is his dad. So I remember that process where I was first told that Steve was my biological father.
People freak out and say, you can't date her.
I mean, I wasn't dating anybody, right? I was 7.
No, I know. But I mean,
it was,
don't get any ideas there.
Yeah, I had no ideas. And it was all being told to me for the first time, and I kind of rubbed it off and went, all right, back to playing cops and robbers in the woods, right? No big deal. Fast forward to the summer of 1995, when I was 9 years old, a movie comes out called Searching for Bobby Fischer, which for those of you who haven't seen it, I'll give a big endorsement. It's a phenomenal movie.
It is.
Regardless of the fact that it was magical for me in terms of chess. And I watched this movie and became obsessed with the idea of getting good at chess. And so that's kind of where it began in terms of my journey. I was, until that point, living at the bottom of the totem pole in the collective, having a blast as a kid in the village, very ignorant in terms of my mother and father's past, let alone kind of the foundings of the collective or much of the things I've explained to this point. And just doing my thing, right? And at this point, now that I know how to play chess, Dallas, who was Marlowe's first son before she married my dad. So Dallas is Marlowe's son from a previous marriage, just like I'm my father's son from his marriage with Debbie. We're stepbrothers, although I don't even know that or think of that because at the time I'm a kid, not really thinking too much about the biological or lack thereof relationships.
He's kind of a brother to you?
Yeah, we're friends. I mean, we're like every kid in the village, pretty close, right? I mean, I would say at some point, like probably the kids in my generation growing up would say that we probably had closer relationships than most like families, you know? I mean, even if you weren't blood with someone, because we were in a very small group.
You would have thought of him as a stepbrother, right? I mean, he's your dad's stepson, right? So, yeah, okay.
Again, I didn't use the term stepbrother.
Yes.
But yeah, so Dallas and I got obsessed with chess. And we played all that summer into the fall. And that was when I first developed a relationship with Stephen Camp. Because until that point, you know, there wasn't really much of a reason for me to be kind of dealing with Stephen and Trina Camp as the bosses of the collective.
But Camp was a super fan of chess, it turns out.
Yes, and so, but Stephen Camp, you know, regardless of the things about the collective, was genuinely loved chess and loved the game. He had been following it that summer or into September. There was a world championship match going on between Garry Kasparov and Vishwanathan Anand in New York in 1995. So he was following that. He loved that we loved chess. Everyone loved Searching for Bobby Fischer as a movie. So it was kind of this thing that was happening. And then we played in our first chess tournament in October of 1995, just after I turned 10. And I lost every game. I did not do very well. But
Dallas did better.
Dallas did much better. But that didn't change Stephen Camp's perspective in terms of what he saw in me for whatever. Again, I say this now because he's both, you know, said it for many years, and obviously I did get very good at the game. So he clearly saw something, and he wasn't wrong. He was like, all right, Danny like has a knack for this game, right? And so despite my poor performance, Stephen Camp was very quickly putting together a chess team at the Shelby School with more kids joining me in Dallas. And
that's Shelby School's a private school.
So the Shelby School was the private school that served the collective kids.
Yeah.
It was a private school in Tona Village. And so the Shelby School was where we grew up playing chess, and very quickly Stephen Camp had a chess team that he was overseeing and had kind of full say-so over everything we did, which for us was freaking awesome because we played a lot of chess in a village where cops and robbers took a back seat to playing chess. And we had a program that would rival, I would say, maybe every intensive chess program that's ever existed. I mean, it was every day for hours. And that's how, you know, a small group of kids get really, really good at chess very, very quickly.
When you're a kid and you're just free range having a blast, you just remember the good stuff. But you also mentioned septic tanks and dark water and kind of levels of poverty, but also just living from house to house to house, not knowing who quite your guardian is.
Yep.
And it would be easy to both glorify and trivialize the childhood that you experienced. And that's not even getting into kind of the chess, you call it chess gypsy dynamic. We're talking before chess even begins. It's in some ways idyllic and in some ways traumatizing childhood. Is that fair to say?
For sure. And I guess you're right. I kind of focused on the glory days of what it was like to be a kid. But as I share in the book, there's, you know, in hindsight, you look back and go, there was a lot wrong here, right? There was a lot of things that were not good. We were all living in cabins, 2 to 3 families to a home. These are like 2 to 3 at most bedroom homes. You know, I shared bedrooms
people
with 10 to 15 kids. Yeah. We shared bathwater to save money. We had no shoes. There was a shoe list where everyone would put their name on a shoe list in order to be in line to get shoes. Turns out there was no shoe list, and it was just sort of a way to kind of oversee whether someone really needed shoes or not. And, you know, a lot of the cabins, which were supposed to be seasonal homes in the summer, were full year, were not only year-round fully used houses, but overused houses based on the multiple families living in them. So there were you know, the men in the collective would be pumping septic illegally into the forest at night, and doing the best they could to maintain the homes. So there were a lot of things that, you know, that screamed for what it was, which is that we were a communist group, financially merged, barely making ends meet, living in poverty in a very small village in northern Arizona, right? And as a kid, again, you do what you do and everything's okay, right? And there is a lot of great stuff to that, and there's maybe a lot of deep metaphors there, right? But there was also a lot that wasn't good. And of course, as you grew into young adulthood and adolescent, you became more and more exposed to all this stuff. And so back to the chess team, very quickly the chess team got very good. We won multiple national championships, and this is well known in the chess world. The Shelby School at its peak was a bit of a legendary team. I was the best player, but there were so many just amazing chess players. I mean, we had multiple kids on the team who were top ranked for their age in the country, and so as we're winning national championships, we're also getting more and more attention. But early on in that road, we also ran into someone named Igor Ivanov. And Igor Ivanov has his own crazy story in terms of how he defected from the Soviet Union, which he would say the Soviet Union, not Russia, because at the time it was the Soviet Union. Yeah. He defected to Canada, eventually makes his way to the States, eventually finds himself in Phoenix, Arizona, and eventually bumps into Stephen Camp and the collective kids, and then eventually is offered a job to move to the Tunnel Village to be the chess master in residence to help teach all the kids. And so I'm skipping past that story, not just because in the interest of time. It is a fascinating story, and it is in the book, but just to get to the point, which is that Igor Ivanov was a legend in the U.S. chess scene, not just because of his chess and his talent. At one point, he beat Anatoly Karpov, who was the best player in the world at the time, but also because he was a raging alcoholic. So he fit right into the collective in this way. And Igor put everyone else in the collective to shame in terms of his drinking. Like, this was a bottle of vodka a day human being.
You said bathed in rubbing alcohol. Literally.
Yeah.
How did he have gallons of it?
He just. I mean, this is scenes I'm going to share because we're here. Not that I'm ever holding back, but I always question myself for a little bit. Do you really want to say this, Danny? I guess I'm going to say it. Which is, I mean, I would walk in on him naked in his trailer. Naked in the bath in terms of what I assume was water, but then rubbing like a small bottle of rubbing alcohol like all over his body. Like, he bathed in it. I think he thought it killed the smell of alcohol, and twist ending it didn't, right? It made it worse. And so he was a crazy person in terms of his lifestyle. He was the definition of a chess gypsy, I would say, in that he traveled the world, was living like a rock star, sleeping around where he could, winning just enough money to get to the next tournament along the way, drinking himself to death, literally. I mean, eventually, but ultimately he was also not totally unique in terms of what I would say the professional chess scene looked like, especially in the U.S. in the 80s and 90s, because what you had was a lot of actually Soviet defected immigrants. And the Soviet defectors were the best chess players in the U.S. by far, right? But there also wasn't a lot of money in the U.S., right? So in order to make that work, unless you were going to be a family man and set up shop, which a lot of them weren't necessarily into, this was a thing. And again, these are a lot of people I have a lot of great relationships with, and I don't think any of them would deny this was the case. I think it was the lifestyle. It was what it was, right? And so Igor ended up with an opportunity to join the collective and move up into Tunnel Village and become the chess master in residence. And the deal was that his bills would be paid for. He would be given enough alcohol to be happy, and he would teach the kids chess while traveling and now using Tunnel Village as his home base to travel and do his thing. But he wouldn't have to travel as much if he didn't want to, because his needs would be met. And that was what happened with our relationship with Igor for the 2 to 3 years he was there.
And he became your personal tutor, where it almost seemed like instead of going to school every day, you would just go hang out with him, help him get sober from his hangover the night before, and then he would try and teach you chess to the extent that he was coherent.
He was definitely my personal tuner, spent more time with me than anybody, but I would say that every one of the kids, shout out to all of them who spent enough time with Igor, I'm sure has their own stories that are similar to mine to some degree, but I definitely got more time with Igor than anybody. And a lot of those days, looked like me showing up to either help him nurse the hangover or get dressed and or make him a screwdriver. I learned how to make a vodka orange juice, at 12 years old. A good one too, I guess, for Igor. And so, and then we would work on chess. Igor was not a great teacher. He was not he was not the kindest person, to say the least. He was abusive. He was racist. He said all kinds of inappropriate shit to young boys that he shouldn't have said. But also he became my sparring partner in terms of having somebody to play with. And then as we'll get into, my story with my family in terms of what happened there was a very quickly, Igor became the most consistent figure in my life from the age of like 12 to almost 15. And he was my personal chess mentor for a long time.
I'm trying to, I read this book just in the past day or two. He died when you were 15? Is that right?
No, he died later.
Much later. Okay.
He died.
The timeline's
gosh, I was already in my early 20s. I saw him many years later when he died. Yeah.
So okay, something else made you guys stop working together.
Yeah, and we can talk about that. I mean, ultimately, what happened was that he was in the collective, and again at this time, and we'll back up and talk about how that happened. But I was separated from my mom, a very coordinated abduction that went down, and I was basically kind of a chess orphan. Igor was this consistent figure in my life in the collective, and he and I traveled together everywhere and did chess all the time. And at one point, there were probably two sides of the story. At one point, he became enough of an asshole where Stephen Camp and Trina Camp and my father decided it was just time to get rid of him. And I think that is true. Like, he was an absolutely belligerent, he was a jerk. Also, he was married to a woman who I believe was Mormon.
St. George.
In St. George.
Yeah.
And at one point, she either came into an inheritance or she was like willing to take him back. What's crazy is we didn't know any of this while he was living with us. He was married to Elizabeth the entire time that he was with us, and we didn't know. But part of it was because he married her to get a green card, and she married him for him. He was basically a mail order Igor. That's the reality of what the relationship was. And whatever happened with their relationship, she was either willing to take him back so he didn't need the collective for security or support, and he had been belligerent enough that even with the benefits to the chess team, it was time to get rid of him because he was a fucking asshole, which he was. And so that was, and Igor, wherever Igor is at in the astral realm, I'm sure he would not want me to pretend that he was a fucking asshole, because he was a fucking asshole, and he was abusive in a lot of ways. But he found his way back to Elizabeth, and he left the collective on his own accord.
Well, let's leave this as a reason for people to buy the book. But one of the most tender moments in the book is when he gifts you something at the end of his life that you still have. And someday I want to see that gift, but you have to buy it and read the book. There's so much that the book covers that we're not covering. So please don't worry that because, dear listeners, viewers, we're going into detail, that you don't need to buy the book. The book is going to make today 50 times more interesting and valuable. Anyway, I just had to say that. So, okay, so why don't we talk about the parallel processes, little p, of you growing in the ranks of becoming a chess champion and how your relationship with your mom, with your biological dad, and with Stephen Camp all kind of processed in parallel, along with that whole gypsy. And I know some people consider that term offensive. I'm using it because the book uses it. I'm sure you acknowledge that some people don't like that term.
I apologize also to those who find the term offensive, but it was the best term to use what described the environment for chess professionals at the time. And so anyway, what I would say is that the Shelby School chess team is now very good. I'm an All-American chess player at this time, which is, to make the All-American team, you have to be like in the top for your age. And at the age of 12, probably 11 turning 12, somewhere in there, my purpose became ordained by Dr. Durran in a trance. And so I was in a trance, a normal kind of group collective trance, and I was told that chess was my purpose, which, again, I've talked about purpose as one of the pillars, right? But the idea of having a purpose was a super important one, because a lot of what was, taught to everyone in the collective was that Trina Camp became who she was and was this successful person that everyone was aspiring to because she committed herself young to her purpose. And she did the hard work of being able to be a trance medium, which wasn't easy. And her ability to create the space for that to be possible was a phenomenon, right? And so she was sort of this like pillar of what purpose meant. And what I would learn kind of later is a lot of times purpose was used to just give people a job, like I said, but to be given a purpose in that sort of heavy way at the age of 12 was pretty rare. I was like a chess purpose prodigy within the collective, right? And so this became a really big deal because the idea of purpose was that we talked about like vibration in the process, but purpose was more important than anything. Purpose was more important than your relation, than all of your biological relationships. It is your entire reason for your soul's being on the planet. And so very quickly, chess became something where it was no longer a fun game where I'm like playing some good chess and helping the team win. It became a thing that my entire life and spiritual self-worth was sort of judged through, right? And this idea that if I was doing well, I was in purpose. If I wasn't doing well, then it could both be sort of called to question. I used the idea where the question was asked, well, is chess still your purpose, Danny? Do you want chess to be your purpose? That was a way that it was sort of weaponized. The tournaments I had, whether good or bad, were always used as sort of the microscope to evaluate everything else in my life. How is my relationship with my mom going? How is my relationship with Dennis going? How is my relationship with anybody going? Am I doing a good job in my purpose? And so,
and if I won,
things were probably going well. But even if I was winning, one of the things that started to become clear was that the idea of whether or not Stephen Camp approved of Debbie and Dennis being the ultimate say-sowers of my life, because they are my parents, if chess was this ultimate purpose. And Stephen Camp, through the success of the Shelby School chess team, saw that my success in chess was very good for the collective, right? It said a lot of good things, right? It's hard to argue, at least in the chess world, that things are wrong at the Shelby School, because the Shelby School was winning every damn chess tournament. And Danny Gordon at the time, because that was Dennis's name, my name was Danny Gordon at the time, was winning a lot of chess tournaments, and I was an All-American. And so,
can I just say, it reminded me a little bit of Tom Cruise and John Travolta to Scientology, like cult leaders, or Osmonds to the Mormons, or Steve Young to the Mormons. Like any high demand religion or cult loves to have a celebrity that can be kind of like the face and the global spokesperson for the brand, kind of like you were to chess.com. It almost seemed like in my read that Stephen Camp was trying to grow you to be the celebrity face of his movement.
I think that's totally fair. And yeah, and that's, again, the analogy is what it is, or the comparison, but within the collective, I can say for sure that that's a totally fair, conclusion to arrive at, right? And it was both overt and subliminal, right? It was both directly said when I was doing well, like, do you have any idea how important this is? Do you have any idea how much God you're bringing to the planet by winning chess games? Do you guys even get how big of a deal it is that you're doing this? Those types often framed through the question of like, yeah, like we do, like, okay, this is great, right? And then if it's not going well, it's like, hey, like, if your purpose isn't doing well enough, like literally nothing is more important than your ability to bring God through the planet through chess. So what do we got to do to make that possible, right? I would, again, learn later, just as I said, I learned things later about my parents' marriage. I would learn later that there was open discussions Stephen Camp was having privately among the leaders of the collective that he was just going to adopt me, that he was going to take me away from Debbie and Dennis, my mom and stepfather. One of the things that I learned happened was that Marlo basically freaked out at that idea, because she was like, I'm not going to have Danny as my brother. Also, if anybody should adopt him, it should be Steve Rensch. He is his father. And it's so weird to unpack the fact that my father was basically kind of like either way, didn't really know or care what to do, right? Also, Stephen Camp was in charge of everything. But what I would learn is that there were multiple processes where this was openly discussed in terms of where Danny was going to land.
You're reminding me of the book that if Stephen Camp had adopted you, then you would have become your own uncle.
Yeah, which is crazy, right? And so these things were being openly. I didn't know this at the time, but as I explained, there was a very planting of seeds here, sprinkling fairy dust here of ideas, but ultimately it built up to this point where I was first separated from my mom and told I needed to live with different people to have different experiences in order to grow spiritually. I bounced around the collective and lived with a number of different families at the age of 12. And that's why I said my separation really started at the age of 12, because I was taken from my mom, living with families I didn't want to live with. One of the winters, I actually got super sick, but they wouldn't let me move home because they were told I was told I was making up the sickness, to be with my mom, and that it wasn't real. And there was all kinds of stuff there that were, taking a lot of years to unpack, that stuff. But it was abusive and traumatic already. But then I went back and lived with Debbie and Dennis for a short time. Ultimately, that summer was when Stephen Camp basically told me directly that it was time for me to go live with my father, and that my mom and Dennis had been kind of being told the same thing, because on their side, it was like, hey, one, do you really want to stand in the way of Danny's purpose? Would you actually do that? His
to
purpose,
your mom. To your mom,
his purpose is more important than any of this, right? And also, the fact that you're so obsessed with him, is that a sign that you're still in love with Steve Rensch? Is that a sign that there's something wrong in your marriage? I think to protect your marriage, you need to let this boy go. Let him go figure out his purpose so you can work on your marriage, Debbie. And Danny, Christ's last words were, who is my mother, who is my father? Purpose comes before anything, in terms of, like, that was the seeds that I was being planted with, right? And so we had this experience where I was taken from my mom, and I was willingly involved to doing it, despite the fact that we were both in tears and gritted teeth in the whole process. And it was...
And she tried to act like she was
nuts.
fine with it too, right? So,
yeah, but she was not only fine with it. I mean, there were moments where I would learn later that once I left, she literally broke down and screamed to the point where my adopted sister, Noelle, Debbie and Dennis eventually would adopt a sister. She was 7 at the time, would say that she still hears my mom's blood-curdling scream, sometimes, that it's that traumatic, that it was like, what the fuck was going on here, right? And it was just crazy. So I basically was separated from my mom at the time in order to be with Steve and Marlo as my parents, my dad. But very quickly, I wasn't actually living with them. I was living alone in the Valley, because being in the Valley, the few houses that the collective still had on 7th Street made it easier for me to travel.
So, so your mom is sort of conditioned. So basically, your mom's first husband was taken away from her by the collective, in effect. This is my words, not yours. And now her son's being taken away from her by the collective. And yet, during the event when it's happening, you're convinced by the collective that that's the right thing to do, and she's convinced that it's the right thing to do, and she acts indifferent, which has you then leaving feeling like your mom didn't even give a shit about you, which is all sorts of twisted.
The fact that I can talk about this now, one, without sobbing, or the fact that I can get through it, is its own testament to just, years of therapy, years of reflecting and understanding, and the fact that I eventually would, after many years later, it would be 10 years before my mom were really back in each other's life, which is its own crazy thing that we could be in the same collective and not speaking. And we'll talk about that if you want. But it's hard to describe how fucked up that feels in your gut, to be like knowing that something is wrong and the other person knows it's wrong. You're both willingly participating in the act under the idea that it's the right spiritual thing to do. It's hard to explain, what that was. I obviously go into great detail about it in the book, and it was just absolutely nuts. And my mom and I would talk later, and she would say that all the things in terms of what was not going right in her brain at the time, wishing she had done it differently, and ultimately taking responsibility for it. And I would come to the compassion of understanding that, she literally was also in a lose-lose situation, given that she was in a cult, and everything that was happening there was so much bigger. And yeah, it's a wild thing that happened, and ultimately put me on a path, ironically, what Stephen Camp thought he was doing, which was to give me the best chance to be successful at chess. And there's all kinds of things that might make other people uncomfortable or not. There's the question of when someone does something that is, an atrocity and a crime, do they think they're doing the best thing or not, right? And there's a lot of evidence to believe that Stephen Camp thought he was doing the best thing by believing that this was the best thing, despite the pain that it caused. But of course, the twist ending was that by creating this separation for me and my mom and essentially orphaning me in the valley, I became the village bicycle, which meant like nobody owned me. Right. And so when no one owns it, it's like a village car, which literally I experienced village cars. There were cars that were owned by people that people in the village were allowed to use. Those cars stay clean. And the reason that happens in our human dynamic is because when you feel accountable to another human being, you will pick up the McDonald's trash on the floor. If it's a collective car, everybody leaves it because it's nobody's problem. Right. And so it takes something happening, which is like, somebody gets processed and says, you got to go clean the fucking Baragata, like clean the car, right? Or, hey, you got to handle this, or it doesn't happen, right? And so that's like I think there's a lot of experiments that have been explained by George Orwell better than I can, right? In terms of what happens in communism and different dynamics, right? But that was a thing that was happening, and I was a kid living alone in the valley. Steve and Marlo were my parents. We saw each other on holidays, and there was definitely dynamics that I explained where I was obviously developing a relationship with them, despite the fact that I was crying myself to sleep many, if not most nights about what had happened to me. But for all practical purposes, I didn't belong to anybody, right? I was being neglected in the valley, and ultimately the path that Stephen Camp was trying to created a much bigger problem, which was that I was a broken human being with all kinds of fucking issues, mental health wise, right? And also physical health wise, that kind of tore my life apart.
Yeah. And I'm pretty sure your biological dad and Marlo legally adopted you, right?
I actually don't know if they ever did.
Regardless,
I changed my name. I did change my name to Danny Rensch.
That's right.
Rensch is my father's name. I don't know if they ever legally adopted me. That's a really good question, because there's a lot of, I was as I share in the book, I was thrown back and forth so many times, even as a young kid, that I didn't even know they were wrestling over guardianship, that I literally don't know who my legal parents were by the end.
But you changed your legal name.
Yes.
But even then, it didn't last very long. You're living with your biological dad and Marlo, right? Just because there was so much tension in the family about adding a new teen, that was
yeah. Well,
explosive.
I wasn't living with them, or I was and wasn't, right? They were living in the village. When I was in the village, I lived with them, but I was also living in the valley alone a lot and overseen by different people who were down there. The way it worked was there were a couple of houses on the block. We called it the block on 7th Street. And the block houses were used for people who were doing stuff. Like there were people who were going to school at ASU, or there were people who were, and sometimes it was like where people were sent when they were kind of being punished. They were sort of being cast away from the main core epicenter of Tonto Village. There were all kinds of reasons why those houses were being used, but they were being used for Danny because it was the easiest place for me to live in order to travel. And I guess what I'm getting to is Steve and Marlo were my parents. I was also down there a lot. I was down there with Igor a lot of the time too. There were also other parents who were there who kind of oversaw me, but I was basically there alone doing my life, if that answers the question.
I'm wondering if you would have qualified of some sort of child neglect or abuse, and or if any non-members of the collective, like community members, ever turned the collective in for what I think some would say is child neglect or abuse. I don't know.
I think everybody who came in and out of my life at those times, who was taking me to chess tournaments, taking me to the airport, like they loved me. And I think that, again, what I would say is like people did their best, right? Given that I wasn't their kid. And I would actually say what was funny is, I mean, there were definitely some bad relationships, some people who abused me and took advantage of the situation, the fact that I had no parents. That definitely happened, and I share some of that for sure in the book. But there were also a lot of people who like just kind of loved Danny. They didn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole because no one wanted to get in trouble by calling out the fact like, why hasn't this fucking kid been sent home to his mother yet? Why isn't he with Debbie? Something's wrong here. The few people who spoke up about it, and there were people that did, would just get destroyed in processes, right? Don't bring this up. This is bigger than you. This is, why haven't you overcome your blood? It would be turned on them. In fact, it happened many times. I saw it where they'd be like, why are you so obsessed with biology? Why do you believe that biological relationships are more important than your spiritual purpose? Because Danny's fucking got it right. Danny has got his spiritual purpose on track. So why don't you worry about your own shit and not question this? It was a kind of thing that would happen, right? And so people were both like loving me and supporting me. And I had a lot of people who did, and also not really touching it unless they were drunk enough at a process to fuck up and do it and then get destroyed, right? And so what I would say is that was all happening despite the fact that I didn't really have anybody who owned me. If you know, because in this term, I'm using ownership in a good way, right? Someone who really oversaw me in an accountable way. And so, that was its own problem that would develop. But I would say that the relationships themselves, I think people didn't think about turning it in either because they spiritually believed it. Maybe they thought it was okay, even if it didn't sit well with them, or they were not actually abusing me. They were doing the best they could by this kid who was kind of in a weird situation. Everyone really knows that Stephen Camp is actually his father. Steve Rensch's biological father was posing as his father. He doesn't really have a relationship with Debbie anymore. Let's not talk about that because that's not. I don't want to turn on my family. And those were kind of different unspoken dynamics that were bouncing around.
Yeah, and there must have been a lot of secrecy in terms of people outside the group, because I'm just wondering if non-members who were just neighbors or community members could have ever observed sort of child neglect.
Well, it's interesting. I think in the world of chess, people asked a lot of questions. There were people who asked, like, why did you change your name from Danny Gordon, or Daniel is my actual name, but Daniel Gordon to Daniel Rensch? There were a lot of questions like that. But I was complicit and cooperative in the lie, which was like, hey, well, my parents were divorced a long time ago, and I just should have changed my name. They just finally got to it. That was what I said. That's true.
Yeah.
But it's not true, right? Yeah. And so I would find very quick ways. Meanwhile, I'm playing chess and I'm doing well, and ultimately that's like the main goal. And so many people saw my name change. It was a hot topic for a little while, especially because I was a very publicly known kid. It was like there's this all-American kid, Daniel Gordon, who is now Daniel Rensch. What happened to him on the top list, right? And I had a lot of those questions for a while. Eventually they went away because, yeah, I think I either told enough people or people kind of stopped questioning, or secretly, like you said, they kind of knew something was off, but didn't know what to do about it, or even who to talk to about it.
Yeah, maybe another way to say this is, like, let's just say we tell this story to a social worker in Arizona who's a caseworker. My guess is a social worker, there are at least some caseworkers in Arizona that would hear your environment and say that's neglect.
Oh, in no way am I trying to justify it.
No, I'm not saying you are.
Yeah.
I'm just wanting to, as an observer.
Yeah.
It sounds like the best of times, the worst of times, an amazing upbringing in some ways, and a wretchedly horrible, abusive upbringing in other ways.
Yep.
It's both, but I want to call it as both, which I think you do too. Yeah.
I do too. I think that's kind of, we've already touched on some of the bigger spiritual frameworks of the entire experience, which is allowing for opposing truths to exist, which is hard at times and not as easy as being black and white about it. But I think that you're nailing another one for sure. I think that it was both good and bad. And if we're just, talking even further, I mean, we know I'm here because of, being a co-founder at chess.com and the uniquely awesome ride and great thing we built, that I wouldn't be here probably unless everything I've said so far did happen.
Right.
Because to some degree, the fact that I was playing chess how I was and being neglected led to kind of everything that would come later and ultimately finding my way to chess.com.
And Camp's attention with you at such a young age, and the school he built and all the resources that he gathered from the collective that then he diverted your way. Like, it's such a mind fuck, I guess.
Yeah.
Let's talk about your successes before the ear stuff happens, just to give people a sense for
I was a top, rise. Yeah, I was a top player in the country for my age. I
talk about the levels first, just for those who care.
So to explain the chess rating system, when you reach the 2200 rating barrier, you become a master, which is obviously a big title. People think of a chess master, right? And so I was the youngest chess master in Arizona history. I was one of the youngest chess masters in the U.S. A lot of records have continued to be broken, right? So now it's funny, being in the position I am at chess.com, it's almost awkward to refer to myself as a prodigy because I now have seen what's happened over the chess revolution. There are prodigies who are breaking all the records that I and others set many times over. So I do not compare myself to certain prodigies, but I certainly was, and objectively, like, in the top 0.00001%. And I was breaking records, became the youngest master in Arizona history. I was reaching 23 and 2400, which, you move into the professional rankings of, when you're that highly rated, not only are you competing in elite invitationals, especially for your age, like U.S. Junior Championships, and I was winning national championships, but yeah, you're well on your way to what looks like becoming, a U.S. champion and maybe being able to compete for the World Championship. And so there were, into 16, 17, I was competing, among the best in the world for my age, chess is what is the best ecosystem to describe it? It's like golf in that, like, no one owns chess, no one owns golf. There are all types of state organizations and national organizations and UJGA and PGAs and different things. And so ultimately your rating is like your handicap, and no one can argue with that. No one can argue with your chess rating or your golf handicap, no matter what. They can see how good you are. And so I was ranked, even though not everyone in the world always competes against each other. The junior in Arizona is not always playing the junior in Moscow, but you have a rating that allows you to make comparisons in terms of how good they are on a global level, if that makes sense. So I was one of the best in the world, and yeah, that part of the plan was going well, I guess.
And then privately, you started to develop some unhealthy coping. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So I would say the first unhealthy coping started with, and again, I'm not going to pretend to preach or talk about all the different roads that might lead to someone's substance abuse. It's a very heavy topic, and all types of things can happen to people to get there. But I will say a common thread of, like, self-loathing, self-deprecation in terms of your views and behavior, depression can often be the trigger points to it. And for me, panic attacks was something that I now look back and realize I was having at a very young age. And
probably because of the pressure.
For sure, because of the pressure. Also, because I was, orphaned and away from my mom and not doing well, and so. Also,
you mentioned OCD. That's what I specialized in as a psychologist.
Oh, okay.
And that is known as an anxiety disorder. So high anxiety, right?
Yeah, I had high anxiety, to say the least. I was completely OCD. I describe a lot of these behaviors. I now know that very early on, I probably started the thought process of ruminating. Rumination is not necessarily depression itself, but it is also a symptom, right? Your inability to kind of work through. And so you find other things to focus on. You count and you look for patterns and you do things, right? And so I was.
That's the O in OCD.
Yeah, I was depressed. Yeah. Right. For sure.
But constant rumination is what can often lead to the depression, because you become exhausted.
Yeah.
Because you're always obsessing, ruminating. So
okay.
Anyway, yeah.
But you just taught me something, maybe, though, because I can, I was ruminating in my own brain all the time, justifying to myself what had happened. Yep, I made the right choice. I'm with my spiritual parents.
Leaving your mom.
This was always meant to be. Everything's going to be okay. Yeah, this is what's so in God. Like, you find yourself in a cycle of, like, convincing yourself that what doesn't feel good is good.
It wears you out.
Right, and wears you out.
Become depressed.
Yeah, and so. Yeah, I guess that's what happened. And it's funny because my therapist and I've talked about a lot of stuff, but I've never actually diagnosed that. And so yeah, I first, alcohol again was a massive part of the collective, as was smoking cigarettes. No marijuana or drugs, actually. I mean, people did it, but it wasn't endorsed in the same way. Alcohol and cigarettes were, and so I drank and smoked at a young age. Probably had my first cigarette at 9, probably had my first actual tried drink at like 12. But I first drank when I was 16, having visited Russia. I was there for a series of tournaments working with trainer Mark Dvoretsky, Sergei Dolmatov. For the chess audience tuning in, they'll know those names. They're like, Dvoretsky has since passed away, but he was probably considered the world's most elite trainer. I worked with Igor Zaitsev, who was Anatoly Karpov's trainer. And so I drank heavily 1 or 2 nights while I was there. But coming back from that trip was when I first started really heavily drinking, like all the time. both in secret, but also not in secret because it didn't have to be in secret. Dallas and I were drinking buddies in many ways. And Dallas has his own story, which I won't tell, but Dallas was an incredible athlete. He actually got a Division I basketball scholarship. He
played at Southern Utah.
He played at Southern Utah.
Another Utah connection.
Yeah. So Dallas has his own story of pressure and the problems that he developed in his own life, which again is his story to tell. But Dallas and I were drinking buddies, right? And so we were over drinking at the ages of 16 and 17, to say the least, and we weren't alone in that. But as brothers, stepbrothers, I was now welcomed back to the Rensch family. There was a brief stint where Dallas and I weren't getting along, and he kicked me out. It's in the book. We're going to move past it because it's just too long of a story and complicated. But I'll just say that he and I were close at that age of 16 and 17, and partly because we had a very shared experience of, we probably were the kids with the most pressure on us of like anybody to perform and take the spiritual mission out into the world. And that led to our own kind of, early substance abuse is what I would say.
Yeah. Yeah. So that you're battling that, which really is just a way to anesthetize or medicate the anxiety and the pressure and the stress and the trauma that you experienced as a child and as a teen.
For sure.
And then the ear stuff starts, the ear stuff was also building all along. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, in hindsight, as I've now kind of foreshadowed enough times, and like you said, people will read all the details in the book. But one of the things I really loved doing in the Valley was swimming. It was my favorite thing to do. I probably swam more than I should have because I should have been studying more chess. At least that's what Stephen Camp would say. But yeah, so swimming, and as I pressure my ear right now, which hurts when you talk too much at times, but I would lead to having all types of ear infections, driving up and down the valley to Tono Village, the valley to the mountain, as we called it, being on plane flights. I had earaches and pains all the time. This wasn't something I brought up, partly because I didn't have a natural mother to bring it to. And so it was kind of a scary thing for this woman who wasn't my mother, and she was young, and Marlo didn't really even want me in her family. And there, it would take years for her and I develop our own relationship, even as dysfunctional as it probably is now. Whatever the relationship is we've developed, like that would take years to come. My dad came from a Christian Science background. And so,
don't go to the doctor.
I say this, which was basically the idea that any physical ailment is a spiritual manifestation of a deeper problem. And so, my dad was just always so heavy in processes with me, which was like, well, if your ears hurt, what are you not hearing? What do you don't want to hear spiritually? And so it became a thing where I was hiding my ailments because of the fear of what it meant. And pretty much any physical problem I had was always made to be my mom's fault. And so that became a thing where it was like, it was hard to talk about. So unless I was legit in pain, I didn't talk about it. And so, growing into my late teens, and we're skipping past a little bit to the fact that I, would meet my wife, and she has her own story, and she and I are already fully moved in together at the ages of 17 and 19, because that's what happened in the collective.
Her name is
Shauna.
Shauna.
Yeah. And so, but I, eventually my ear problems would literally like explode and collapse on a plane flight home from the U.S. Junior Championship in Lindsborg, Kansas. And we would find out that I had developed a benign, not malignant, but a benign growth, had eroded my ear bones, my stapes in particular, and everything had kind of fallen apart at once, given that it was years and years of scar tissue and built up neglect, and lost my hearing, and ended up having a number of ear surgeries over the next couple of years, basically taking my chess career as the top junior in the U.S., not named Hikaru Nakamura, who now is a friend who I work with at chess.com, and Hikaru is the number 2 player in the world currently.
Does he work for chess.com?
He's a partner of ours.
Okay.
He's a creator. Okay. He streams content and does things, and so he and I have known each other.
My son loves him.
Since we were kids.
My son's a big fan.
Yeah.
Y'all have known each other since you were both kids. You played against each other in tournaments.
Yeah, because we were both very top juniors. I first met Hikaru when he was 8 and I was 10, right when I started playing chess.
That's awesome.
And so,
that's awesome.
But yeah, so Hikaru is, and I'm not even comparing myself to Hikaru, because seeing what Hikaru and Magnus Carlsen and the top prodigies became, Hikaru had already surpassed me, even though I was older. So Hikaru was like the top prodigy coming in the U.S., but I was, the highest rated and among the top 5 kind of with Hikaru there. But I didn't play for 2 years and would be under and in and out of the knife, if you will, right, under surgery. And yeah, that was what happened.
And that would be, maybe if Hikaru's Michael Jordan, that would be like, what's another contemporary? Larry Bird having an Achilles rupture when he's playing for Indiana State. Yeah. He's like on the rise, viewed as maybe the one or two best basketball player in the world or whatever. And then to have your trajectory, your inertia, your momentum cut short so dramatically on that ascent, I just like, on top of all the other things that we've already talked about, all the trauma and distress and neglect that you had experienced, like that's enough to maybe for some people not to make it through. Let's just be candid.
Yeah, I mean, I will not compare myself to Larry Bird because Larry's a legend. I'm a huge basketball fan. I will not. I will say that yes, it's not out of the realm of we'll never know. Right? We'll never know how good I could have gotten. And I would argue that even regardless of the ear problems that came, my trajectory had already started to get slower in many ways because I was a broken human being. I was a mentally ill, heartbroken kid, who hadn't fully realized what was to come in terms of his issues that were developing. With alcohol it was, but there were other issues to come. And so I have perspective about it now, and maybe some of my success allows me to swallow the pain of what could have been, but I also don't look at it with regret. So I can say that the comparison you made, I will not compare myself in the same way to Larry Bird, but it's not an out of whack comparison that I was a top player. I was a top prodigy. This person goes on to be one of the greats. I was training with Mark Dvoretsky and doing some awesome shit, and ultimately it was all cut short. And Hikaru always teased me about that I'm Dvoretsky's biggest failure. He said that, which is I like to think Hikaru says out of love. But given what my potential was, it didn't come to fruition, right? For sure. And so yeah, that is not a crazy comparison, and it happened very, very fast. And then it forced me on a different path, right? A path where I was with my very young wife, married very young and pressured to have children very young, as with the collective still being in charge, and Stephen Camp and Stephen Marlowe and Stephen and Trina. But also, ironically, as fate would have it, it pushed me into a path where at the intersection of Danny's chess career and mental health problems are coming here, mental and physical health problems are coming here, and here comes the internet, here comes YouTube and the early conversations that are like, MySpace was still a thing, not even Facebook, right? Let alone other things. And so now in hindsight, people look back and think it's silly when you say, like, I actually said to somebody, what's YouTube? Watch this video on the internet. I'm like, what? Where can I see it? It's on YouTube. What's YouTube, yeah. Right? That was a thing, right? And so that was all happening right around then.
You mentioned that Eric wanted chess.com to be the MySpace of chess at one point. Did I get that right?
Yeah, that was his thing, was the MySpace of chess, which was not a bad thing to say. Eric, now we use it to make fun of him and whatever, but that was
huge
that
before
MySpace
Facebook.
Was huge, right?
Yeah,
so that was it.
Made all the sense in the world.
Yeah.
And community is a big deal, and identity is a big deal.
Yeah.
So that was an important component.
Yeah,
for sure. So that's a big crash. It's just another thing that you had to absorb while you're dealing with a new marriage, new kids, your addiction, and all the past trauma.
Yeah.
Again, those 2 years were probably super dark for you, I'm guessing.
I mean, you're saying that like you haven't read the book. I'm teasing you, but of course, no, of course, for the audience, yeah, they were the worst years, right? They were the worst years of my life. You always knock on wood when you say that because you never know what's ahead and in store for you in the universe. But those years were. I was abusing alcohol, to say the least. I also, in my panic attacks, and I had been subscribed Klonopin and Xanax, and I was taking those with alcohol, abusing them, and that I was hiding that from my wife. I would lie to her whether I had taken it with alcohol because she was worried about me. And
those are benzos, right?
Smoking a lot. What?
Those are benzodiazepines. I mean, that's how Judy Garland died, with alcohol and benzos.
Oh yeah, together. I think I was being careful. I don't know. I mean, I know that I use the term addict loosely out of respect to, like, I don't want to ever grandulize thing, whatever, but I was abusing substances, and I've defined it through my therapist in terms of helping what defines that type of behavior. There are a couple of things, which is, one, are you hiding it? And two, does your behavior change when under the influence? And I definitely checked both those boxes, right? And it was for several years, and we had our oldest son, Nash, and at this point, around the start of chess.com, we had our second son, Warner. So I had just turned 23, and we have 2 kids.
And so we're saying Shauna grew up in the collective as well.
Yeah, Shauna has her own long story.
You don't have to tell her story.
Yeah. She both grew up in the collective and didn't. But I think the part that is like crazy in terms of coincidental and just, will obviously, increase people's appetite to understand the story is that.
And to buy the book.
Well, I mean,
and to buy the book.
And not that they shouldn't anyway, but I would say that, so Shauna's mother, Kathy, and her father, Rick, were in the collective. Rick also left Shauna's mom to marry the second oldest daughter of Stephen and Trina.
Vibration fails again. Or succeeds again.
Right. So Rick marries the second oldest daughter. Kathy left the collective because she was afraid that at some point her kids would be encouraged to choose new parents and be taken from her, which is obviously odd given that her oldest daughter, would ultimately marry me, right? And so they lived in Chicago. They were not in the collective. Shauna was not raised in the collective in the same way I was. And as she and I have unpacked a lot about our different experiences of life and perspective, I'm eternally grateful for that. Because even though she carries similar damages and wounds in terms of the experience of her father leaving her mother for a daughter of Stephen and Trina and things that went down, she also, I think, when she did come back, her family ultimately moved back to the collective, and you would go, why? There was a lot of crazy stuff going on in Kathy's life that I'm not going to get into, but she moved back. And part of what Shauna had, I think, with a lot of hindsight we've looked at, is she both very quickly knew very quickly saw parts of it where like, this is fucked up, this is a cult, but also had such an interesting experience in the world and had seen her mother fuck up so many things and had these horribly abusive relationships, that she also had a very interesting appreciation for the parts of the community that were good. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so I was with this young girl who...
Because you know what? The only thing worse, this is an exaggeration, but there are things worse than a cult. Loneliness and aimlessness are 2 things that are potentially very toxic.
For sure.
Potentially worse than a high demand religion. And that's why... I think that's why cults and religions exist. And that's why they shouldn't only be demonized. Yes, call out all the bad, but clearly they meet a need or they wouldn't be constantly recreated across generations.
Well, I think that's totally fair. In addition to, debates that we all have about, forget why we're here, how are we here? There are miracles that are undeniable to the human existence. And again, we're not getting into the metaphysical, but I'm just validating that I think the 3 things are loneliness, aimlessness, and an undeniable hunger that human beings have to know why we're here. Like, how did this miracle of life happen? So I think when you have those 3 things, it's easy to understand how spiritual and religious frameworks can and maybe even should exist to some degree, but not with the negative behaviors and manipulative reasons.
Yeah, let's just say existential despair is the 3rd thing.
All that stuff,
existential despair, loneliness, and meaninglessness and purposelessness. That's toxic.
So my wife is now in the collective as a teenager because she came back. She's going to ASU, but she's in the collective. And I think being with Shauna, saved my life along with chess in more ways than one. And I write about that. But I think a lot of the perspective she had was not just the things that helped me see I do need to heal my relationship with my mom. What happened to me is not okay. This is fucked up. This is not good. But also, she saw a lot of good things in terms of having been so lonely, seeing what can happen to abusive, in abusive, toxic relationships when people don't have supportive community. And she had so much perspective that even if she didn't know she did have it, right? And so there was a lot of things happening there around this time, while also I'm a wreck of a human being dealing with all types of shame around the fact that I didn't just fail as a chess prodigy, my entire spiritual purpose failed. I'm no longer the Stephen Camp apple eye, or the apple of Stephen Camp's eye, at least to some degree, because until I would start making money at chess.com, I had failed, right? So at this point, I'm like in a bit of a broken situation with a marriage and 2 young babies, with a chess career that has failed. I'm not going to be a chess prodigy anymore. And I'm dealing with all of these substance abuse issues kind of at the same time.
Yeah. Yep. You didn't just fail Stephen Camp, you failed your dad, your biological dad, you failed your entire collective community. Like that's just, you were carrying so much.
Yeah, and a lot of people, again, it's hard because you see it with hindsight that you maybe I was never going to get back on track. But the way you're dealing with failure at the time, I think a lot of people would say this. It's not like you, again, have a black and white epiphany of, oh, I failed. You're denying it. you're in it. You're like, no, I'm going to get back on track. I'm still on the train. Yeah, maybe I'm way behind Hikaru and these other guys now, but I have an excuse. I was bedridden for 2 years, right? And so it wasn't as simple as like I quickly
And you also
came to
couldn't
accept
travel.
it.
You couldn't get on airplanes.
Right, exactly, because of the pressure and everything. So yeah, there's like a self-worth, self-deprecation, depression, and the behavior that you develop because I felt very bad about what had happened in myself because I'm a failure and I'm abusing things because of it. But I'm also denying it at the same time because my whole goal to fix the problem is to still, become one of the best chess players in the world and fulfill the prophecy, if you will, right? And so that would be what I would describe as my early 20s until, like I said, the internet and chess.com, and until I met Eric and Jay, my co-founders, and ultimately the chess.com part of the journey would begin.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So you are paying attention to the internet before you learn about Eric and Jay. You're having your own ideas about how you have your own vision for what chess plus the internet might do. I don't think we talked a little bit about this chess gypsy problem, but there wasn't a viable economy for chess or a viable community at the time that could support a robust economy and competition.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about that because I think that's powerful stuff.
Yeah, that's a big part of what one of my goals was with the book was in addition to, sharing openly and honestly and vulnerably, maybe more than people expected that I would about all these issues. And it wasn't just a cult expose of blame, right? I was sharing all the things that really happened. But I also was trying to help explain how chess.com came to be. It wasn't accidental, and it was partly accidental that somehow this organization, this website that we started just to do something cool with chess and to try to do things differently, kind of fell into a position with an opportunity to really change the game, right? For lack of a better pun. And so the chess world has always had a very feast or famine kind of hierarchy, right? Where like you're either one of the top players in the world or you're traveling and barely making ends meet, or you've given up and you're coaching and you're teaching, right? And so this dynamic had existed forever. And there's
also the Soviet oligarch monopoly, and USSR.
Part of the reason that happened is because chess has also always been revered as sort of the peak of human intelligence, as this intellect. When you dive into what was going on during the Cold War and the dynamics between the U.S. and the USSR and the arms race to the moon and everything else, whatever could be won was up for battle, right? And chess became a huge part of that during the 1972 World Championship match with Bobby Fischer versus Boris Spassky, right? And so chess, even though at that time Bobby Fischer won and became the first and only American world champion in history, Russia was still dominant. Russia, as it is now, the USSR was dominant, right? Because chess was a state-sponsored sport. And unfortunately for all of us in the U.S., Bobby Fischer would go crazy, so chess would not have its moment that what could have become didn't happen, right? And so the USSR dominates chess. But because the USSR is also having a front, which is we're a dominant world power when actually it's a third world country, what was reality was that the best chess players in the world were all of Soviet descent, some sort of Eastern European or Russian country, but there wasn't really an economy to support the amount of brilliant fucking minds that were out there. There were so many good chess players, and there was nothing to win because you were either Anatoly Karpov, Garry Kasparov at the top, or you didn't have a lot. And so this was the world that I grew up in. It was still this world. The U.S. chess scene had started to have a little bit of a circuit. The Continental Chess Tour was this circuit that had open tournaments that Igor Ivanov and others were playing in, but it didn't really have enough money either to do anything besides, like I said, travel as a chess gypsy, right? For lack of a better term, in terms of bouncing around and whatever came with that lifestyle. And so I grew up watching this system, right? While also being told by Stephen Camp, and one thing that he and I would still agree on today, which is that chess deserved better. Chess is an amazing game for human beings. I would say that the reason chess saved my life is because chess is education in so many ways. Chess bridges and breaks down the barriers of culture and age and race and religion and gender. And chess is this thing that is its own language and experience, right? And I would argue that education is more than just the academics, right? More than just reading, writing, arithmetic. It's culture, it's travel, it's food, it's music, it's games, because that is what we experience, right? And so chess, in hindsight, was giving me an education, and I was being exposed to this broken ecosystem, right? And at the same time, the people within the ecosystem would protect it, just like a dysfunctional family, right? That's kind of how it works, because they would be like, the rock stars of the top grandmasters would be like, they don't want to fraternize with everyone else down below in these open tournaments. They were sort of like idolized and put on a pedestal. Yet the fact that they wouldn't fraternize and make the game more inclusive is why you didn't have more money coming in, which ultimately would serve them and maybe allow them to live the life of a Michael Jordan, right? And I could see this dynamic even at a young age, and partly because Stephen Camp also helped me see that dynamic. And he was like, you see how broken this is? And this is why Bobby Fischer left us all in the lurk, because he could have been the person to change that dynamic. Why? Because the U.S. is the richest country in the world. The commercialization of the game should happen here with Western media. And if we had a star who could transcend how chess is currently viewed, like Bobby Fischer could have been, the money that would come into the game would change everything. It would change not just the benefits of the game, and you would have it in more schools, because parents wouldn't be afraid of their kid becoming Igor. They would want their kid to become Magnus or Danny or Hikaru, right? They would want that. And so we could change the game if we had stars.
It's kind of like when Larry Bird, Magic Johnson, Dr. J
changed the NBA. They did. And David Stern also, who wasn't the best commissioner in my book, but again, also had a vision for that, right? That was like Stephen Camp. And he was right about this. Chess did deserve better, and he wanted me to be the person who fulfilled this mission, right? And so what was funny is, even back to the current timeline, even though my life is falling apart, and even though I'm developing substance abuse issues around the self-worth of failing as a chess prodigy and my spiritual mission, what I had sort of assessed, the audit that I had done in my mind of what chess needed, and that this ecosystem could be fixed and that it did deserve better, that didn't go away, despite the fact that I maybe was no longer going to become the next Bobby Fischer, right? The movie Searching for Bobby Fischer was not going to be a story about my life at this time, right? Because I'm falling apart. And so it was crazy, because I still agreed with Stephen Camp about this, and I would agree with him about it to this day. The game deserved better, and I wanted it to be better. And so what started to happen around my own kind of chess failed career was this idea that when I met Eric and Jay, the internet was happening, and my vision was like, hey, the internet is the key. This is how everything is going to change, because the problem with the chess ecosystem as it exists is like, everything relies on local communities, and the idea that you have to be in person to play in a tournament to win money, the idea that you can't even access a great coach. If you're a kid in Costa Rica, not growing up in Moscow at the Moscow Chess Club, you have no chance of becoming a great player, right? The internet was the key to change all that, both in terms of access to content, but also in terms of access to just competition. And imagine growing up with Roger Federer in your backyard to play tennis, right? That's what these kids now have with Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura playing chess online. And so, of course, every one of the sub-bullet points that ultimately got us to where we are now came with a million different hurdles, and it would be ridiculously arrogant for me to pretend like we knew everything that was coming. But what I would say is what was immediately formed was like this crazy failed child chess prodigy who, even if it was for the wrong reasons to got there, had like a crazy passion about fixing this problem. And I had seen what it did to Igor and had seen the brokenness of the ecosystem. And then you had Eric and Jay, who came at the same problem from a different angle, because they loved chess, but they were the ones being gatekept. I was the one who got close enough to the top to see that even the people at the top are part of the problem. They are gatekeeping the experience, and they were the ones being gatekept. They were the ones like, chess deserves better, but there's no chess community for people like us who love the game and want to get better, but we're basically not good enough to fraternize with the chess elite, and we're better than all the beginners, but we want to create a space where everybody can come together.
Jay and Eric also probably would have been seen as a potentially disruptive threat to money and power and community and leadership in the community when they wanted to enter. Is that possible? In addition to
our community? You mean
no, to the existing chess community before chess.com had its ascent.
Oh, that's interesting. Yes, I think in fact, it's funny because they were sort of like given the cold shoulder by a lot of top players, which is always weird when you think back about it, because you go, they just missed so many opportunities to see it. But it was, again, that's what happens in these gatekeeping cultures. It's similar to like what happens when you shun someone in a cult. They sort of re-proselytize themselves, right? And so like there was like this starving artist mentality, but it was like, I like to call it white trash arrogance. I'm poor, but don't fucking tell me I'm poor, right? It's like I'm struggling, but you don't get to tell me that. Yeah. Right. And it's like, and maybe that's an offensive thing to say, but there are a lot of people with problems who don't want to be told they have a problem. Right. Yeah. And I think Eric and Jay were like, hey, we're trying to do this differently. And it's like, don't tell us to do this differently.
Stanford boys.
Who are you to tell us differently?
Palo
right.
Alto kids.
Exactly. Like get out of here kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay. So you meet them at a tournament. Is that right? They attend a tournament where you're playing? Or,
yeah.
Okay.
And I was, still in the process of alcohol and Klonopin and Xanax and smoking cigarettes and all the things that I was doing. But I had, because I was able to travel again, I had, while I was bedridden, taken the Google AdWords course and learned about SEO, and I had seen where this was going, but I didn't have the means to pursue it, and I was still obsessed with becoming a grandmaster and the best chess player in the world, right? And so I'm at this tournament, and in walk these guys with a chess.com shirt, and I know, at least at this point, enough to know that domain name, the name of chess.com, was incredibly powerful, right? And so I'm sparing some of the finer details.
What year is this about? What, 2000?
This was 2008.
Okay.
And so I meet Eric and Jay, and we do not hit it off on the right foot because I'm crazy and want to do this my way because I believe that I have the vision to fix the chess, and I'm probably still even gatekeeping them a little bit because even though I see the problem, I'm probably a part of the problem even more than and I never did that actively, but I can see now in hindsight that maybe I thought I knew better than I did, and it came across that way. But I also, I think, had enough knowledge now to know that I could like they always say the worst amount of electricity to know is just enough to think you can change an outlet, right? And then you electrocute yourself. And so I knew enough to know what I didn't know too, right? And so we started our relationship, and eventually, sparing some of the details there, eventually agreed to start creating content, and eventually started helping to manage and lead content. And in hindsight, that was just the beginning.
And again, the details are fantastic in the book, so don't feel like at all you won't have a lot of really cool, interesting things to learn. Buy the book and read it, please. But you you get the sense, I got the sense from the book, that you had recommitted to becoming a grandmaster, but then when you met Eric and Jay, you that kind of paused you, and you decided that maybe there was a different path for you. Is that fair?
Yeah, yes and no. I would say, again, just like you don't wake up and realize you're in a cult, or at least that wasn't my experience. It was a gray process to get there. But yes, in hindsight, two things were also happening around that time, which was that my wife and I were really not doing well. And I was, in order to earn money, I was going to the valley all the time from the village to teach private lessons, and I was grinding and having panic attacks on drives back home, and our marriage was falling apart, and it was just with two kids. And so the idea that chess.com might be something I could do online, even with slow internet in Tono Village with a BlackBerry phone leaned up against the window to get a signal, that was a huge opportunity, and my wife saw it for what it was, and she pushed me pretty hard to not miss it. And so there was that. And then also, as much as I actually was playing decently well, there was only so much denying that, even if I was going to become a grandmaster, world champion was this is off the table now, right? And maybe US champion because I'm still delusional and lying to myself. But the idea that whatever I was going to do in chess was only going to be through my playing career, that bubble had definitely popped. Even if I was still trying to blow a new bubble or whatever, it had popped, right? And so I think those two things made me see this for what it was, right? Did
you say in the book that chess.com kind of saved your life too, or not?
Well, I talk about how I think chess gave me an education and gave me perspective about many of the good and the bad things about how I was raised over time. But I would say that chess.com coming when it did for sure was a life raft, right? It literally saved my marriage. And I would say my marriage saved my life for sure. So from that perspective, and I I honestly don't remember exactly how I wrote it in the book, but yeah, I mean, the opportunity that was chess.com gave everything else a chance. It gave my marriage a chance. It gave my being a better father a chance at home. It gave, in many ways, being home more in the village started the process of healing with my mom, which I would say was ultimately the most important thing that could have happened. Getting to the other side of what was that, horrific experience and that relationship with my mom, there's a reason the book is dedicated to my mom, right? I mean, everything that happened through the process of healing that relationship and the grief and the sadness that we shared, kind of says it all, right? And so that's what I would say. So chess.com from that perspective gave me a chance.
And weirdly, if Durran had told you, or if Stephen Camp had suggested to you that your purpose was to save chess or to grow chess or to whatever, help chess, it seemed like you were going to have ironically, a better shot at doing that by partnering with Eric and Jay and doing chess.com than even if you had beat Hikaru at some point.
It's crazy because
is that right?
It definitely looks that way now, right? Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't trade my life for the world in terms of how we got here, and I mean that. In that I also, like I said, if you can't change the ending and you've done the work to be happy with your life and to save your marriage and to grow a successful business and to build a community where you're trying to do amazing things and contribute value, you don't get to cherry pick the different obstacles you faced along the way, right? Everyone likes to say the obstacle is the way, but they don't like to say it while they're facing the obstacle. They like to say that shit after they've overcome the obstacle, right? And I think that that's true, and that's still a good thing, right? And I definitely would say I subscribe myself to a lot of stoicism in terms of how I kind of have found peace and choose to rewrite or choose my own story, right? So for sure, what I would say is like, I don't know how to answer that. I was given this spiritual purpose that was then weaponized against me and separated me from my mom and broke my heart a million times over. And I died many times, right? And grieved the death of my mother long before she actually would die, because I as a 13-year-old kid lost her, right? But that path ultimately put me into a situation that led me to chess.com. And it's not even, I think I have managed to do more good for the game with chess.com than I ever would have been able to do as a player, for sure. And so that twist ending, I've joked with my kids that everything in life does happen for a reason, but the twist ending is you get to choose the reason. And I tell my kids that. And so I think from that perspective, yeah, I mean, like, I think it's really weird to be or have gotten to where we did.
And just to kind of close that circle, talk about how Queen's Gambit and other factors, along with the innovations you made along with Eric and Jay, led chess.com to actually elevate chess, because you kind of did. I mean, chess.com has absolutely elevated chess globally. Talk about the fulfillment of the gypsy problem. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's weird, right? Because we are in a time where undeniably the world's oldest game, or one of them, is suddenly so popular again, right? You see kids playing it. The Queen's Gambit on Netflix was a show that I believe is still the most viewed original show they've ever done on Netflix. There are so many things that are to come. I mean, there have been huge scandals. There have been all types of things that have happened over the last few years where people have seen chess everywhere, right? So I'm going to say that, taking for granted that there's no denying we are in a space that, shocking to some people or not, the chess revolution has happened, and or it is only at the beginning. And it's wild to think that a game that used to be criticized for not sexy enough, not enough graphics like other video games, not these things,
not a way to make money.
Yeah, it's never changed. Not a way to make money, to like more people making money than ever. There is a multi-million-dollar creator ecosystem of influencers on the internet, from Hikaru to Gotham Chess, Levy Rosman, to the Botez sisters, to so many others. They make their own money regardless of chess.com, right? Then you have an ecosystem that supports the livelihood of professionals, like we said, fixing the chess gypsy issue, because we went from having 0 to millions of dollars in prizes in esports as a chess event, right? Where chess is one of the most popular and played esports, if you want to call it that, on the planet, right? Meaning just games that people play digitally, right? And then you have the ecosystem on chess.com, which is both, there is an author economy, a marketplace where people can create courses, create lessons. Interested chess improvers pay them directly. Chess.com facilitates both the direct connection between student and coach, and tens of millions of dollars a year are going down in this sort of author and coach marketplace, right? So we have an author and coach marketplace, we have a professional events ecosystem, and we have a creator economy that is kind of insane to think that exists and it happened. But also, it wasn't totally accidental in terms of the Queen's Gambit dumped gasoline on our fire, but the fire was already burning.
You were ready.
We were ready. And a lot of what was happening with the fire was we had built an amazing product, an amazing app for people to play chess and learn chess. But the main two things we had was playing chess, literally, and then solving puzzles, which is where you get a specific chess position and you try to guess the answer, which can be really good for pattern recognition and all these things. We had other things, but those two things paying the bills weren't necessarily enough to keep the game growing. And what was happening around what we now can look back in hindsight, I always say this was the birth of fake news. Unfortunately, people don't know that a lot of the world they live in is information fed to them because the algorithm already knows it's affirming your previously held belief, not actually giving you new factual information. And how did that really start? Well, it started because the social network platforms initially positioned themselves to all of you, everybody, as a social community website, which was you're going to go there to connect and share pictures with family, but that was the main reason to connect. You could get news from other places, you could consume content from other places. But eventually these social networks and the platforms saw that the value in the advertising dollar, the CPM they could deliver to people, was much higher if they just kept you on their site. And if they tracked all of your information, they could deliver you an ad that was super specific where you were going to click on it. And so overnight, these platforms that were positioned to all of the companies, the websites like my own, as a place to grow your brand, were actually the fastest place for people to go and then never leave, right? And once you were only using Facebook, news that was fed to you didn't necessarily have to be fact-checked or stood up, right? Because people were building their entire online experience through Facebook, which was you can connect with people, you could get your information, you could even play your games, right? You could do whatever you needed to do. And so Facebook I use as kind of the cream of the crop of the black box algorithm that was really being positioned as grow your brand, but really you better grow your brand on our site and pay us to grow your brand because we're not actually going to let our users leave. We're not. And how did they limit this? Well, because if you made a post with a link that was external, they literally killed your exposure. Unless you were going to pay them for that post to improve, your CTR, which is your click-through rate, literally died. Like overnight, these websites, which were both Facebook and YouTube and Twitter, and this is even before Instagram and TikTok and others in the world we live in now where people doom scroll and they never leave those sites. This was the early birth of this. And so we were seeing this and I was seeing this, and it was my job specifically to keep our game growing through content, which is written articles and videos and fun things. And we were seeing traffic just die, right? And so we were in a position to make a strategic choice, which was start giving our money to the black box algorithms or change our plan, right? Change the strategy. And so in hindsight, what we did was both data-driven and kind of intuitive, but it was the right call either way, which was, look, we don't have the bottom line to do this anyway. We don't have enough money. And also, it's the wrong strategy anyway in the bigger scheme. This was kind of my theory that I was proposing, which is because we don't own chess, there are always going to be other chess websites to play and learn. We actually can't ever be the only place anyway. And so the only way we're really going to win is by having the best product. And if we have the best product, people will eventually find you. All roads will lead to Rome as long as the game is growing. And so rather than us giving money, let's actually just change the expectation. Stop putting external links in our Facebook posts where they're killing our exposure, because the algorithm was doing that automatically. Stop expecting people to leave our YouTube channel. Just try to grow the YouTube channel. Don't try to use YouTube/chess to get people to chess.com. Just make amazing content. Don't try to use Facebook to get people to chess.com. Just make amazing, buzzworthy kind of quick versions of our content. Give the daily puzzle there for free. Don't make people leave, right? And then when it came to our early ambassadors, your Levi Rosmans, Hikaru's, the Chess Bras, all the people we were working with, what we saw was that even though Facebook was limiting our business, it wasn't limiting celebrities, because they want people to come for the social connect of celebrities. And so we actually turned our ambassador program into like a Trojan horse, where we were using their profiles. We were helping them, and we did a lot of things for them, and everyone has won in the end. So we weren't using them in any nefarious way. We were just like, look, we'll do a lot of the work to help grow your profile. You're just going to play on chess.com and have a chess.com logo. So if anybody finds you, eventually they'll say, well, where do they play? Oh, they play on chess.com, right? And so we built a completely free, before influencer was a term, we built a completely free influencer program, right? Where we were helping them get bigger. And the risk was that by doing that, we were also advertising to members on chess.com to go like their Facebook page. We were letting the door swing open, which was very crazy at the time.
Yeah,
at the time, it was like, you don't do that, right? I
can see that.
And so we were kind of breaking our own funnel, because everything about the business is a funnel. How quickly do you take someone from being impressed of your brand to retaining them as a customer to converting them to a paying user, right? This is the funnel. So we were kind of jumbling the funnel. It was risky, right? And it was the right thing to do, because in the end, when chess did proved to be bigger than chess.com, when we were reminded that no one knows the game, when millions and millions of people were inspired to consider chess again through the pandemic, through the Queen's Gambit, through these other events we had done with celebrities, it wasn't just that chess was everywhere, chess.com was everywhere. We were everywhere, and everybody who was playing chess was playing on chess.com. And we had done right by them, and so they became natural funnels to chess.com, right? And so maybe that was a little longer than you wanted, but it's really, I think it's interesting, because it's a fascinating, we got lucky, but we also kind of didn't get lucky, right? We were in the right place at the right time, because I think we were making the right decision given the difficult choice that Facebook and the other platforms were giving us. And then in the end, the booms came, and we were right where we needed to be. It was literally wild, and the face of our business, or the trajectory of our business, we always joke, it was overnight success 10 years later, right? It was like, all of a sudden in 2020, more than 10 years, but the decade it rolls off the tongue easier to say overnight success 10 years later. We went took 10 years to get 1 million daily active users and 100,000 paying subscribers, to within 8 months, we had 5 million daily active users and 1 million paying subscribers, right? It was a different universe.
And what's the peak been?
The peak, we were at, I think, 12 or 13 DAO, daily active users, at one point. We sit now roughly around 8 million and about 50 million monthly active users.
And it became a $1 billion, in effect, an asset worth over $1 billion. Yeah. Big deal.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know that Durran or Joseph Smith or anyone could have predicted.
No one could have predicted that. Yeah. And Durran would have said he wasn't a fortune teller, right? He was there to help people learn lessons, regardless of the if you believe in it or not. And so there was no crystal ball that saw it coming, other than we had a very committed mission, me, Eric, and Jay, and everyone who came into it, that it was like, chess deserved better. It's being gatekept and protected by the very people we're trying to help, and also chess is for everyone. We have to open the gates here. We have to open the doors in a way that isn't trying to pretend that chess.com is the only place. And there's all kinds of places even now to play and learn chess. And so we've kind of, fallen into having a pretty good size of the market share, but in many ways, it's not because we were trying to drive people to chess.com. It's because we were actually considering ourselves sort of the stewards and the shepherds for the growth of chess in general. And that worked out, because now every time someone sees a chess set on a magazine, they go to chess.com, right? And if they fuck up and go chss.com, Google goes, did you mean chess.com? So we obviously, you know, we had some strengths working for us, you know, in hindsight as well. But yeah.
And I don't think it's a coincidence, and maybe it's a little bit ironic, because I'm sure, as you know, there are a lot of people in the world that view the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormon Church, as a cult as well, or a high demand religion, or not. But it's interesting that it wasn't just you in chess.com that came from a tradition that many people would call a high demand religion or a cult. That's not to say I'm calling the Mormon Church a cult. I'm not. But I'm sure, anyway, isn't that a weird thing that it wasn't just you in chess.com?
Yeah, I don't even know what the comparison is there, other than we were, you know, I joke about it in there that we were all on missions. I'll say that, like, in a weird way. And I know that's a funny parallel to say, because the Mormon Church obviously has missions that people go on, right? We were all on that interesting mission, right? And for chess. And maybe there was a part of the DNA of all of us that whether it was self-righteous or not, we all kind of appreciated that we were doing something bigger than ourselves. And in a weird way, regardless of where the message came from, like, we really believed it. And we still do, from the point of view that, like, look, we want to do right by chess. We are fortunate that doing right by chess has been right by us. And that's not me, like, I'm not even, like, you know, trying to frame that, you know, things are good or bad about the Mormon Church or about my collective or not. That's not really, it's hard for me to make the comparison, but I will say that we all came at it from a place of trying to do things for the greater good, for sure.
Well, I'll just say, as an observer and as someone who's very invested in this topic, if you look at Joseph Smith, claimed special powers, had a sketchy beginning, claimed to be able to speak to the dead, claimed, got his reputation by having special powers, built a communist or a communal society in his early years. There was all sorts of, it was a patriarchy, but there was all sorts of sexual scandal and those sorts of problems. There were all sorts of financial scandals and relational problems, but also a grandiose vision of what could become. And for Joseph Smith, he ended, being killed. And in some ways, as I look at how Trina and Steve, their lives kind of ended, and I don't want to jump ahead because I want to talk to the unraveling for you and the unraveling of the church. But like, in some sense, Joseph Smith was done, this is a dark thing to say, he was almost done a favor by being martyred, because Joseph Smith was killed in 1844. He was martyred as a direct result of everything getting out of control, power-wise, financially, sexually, everything. It's almost like they did the movement a favor, because he didn't have the chance to become old, to become senile, and to have everything kind of fall apart. But just trust me, if you don't have to trust me, but I observe not only profound parallels between your movement and Mormonism and so many other high demand groups that I've studied, but it does strike me as ironic that you could either talk to Eric and Jay and or their ancestors to probably find a lot of parallels of trauma and of... and
that we all left the churches we were raised in, I guess, to some degree. Is that what you're saying? But
also, I don't believe in, I have this weird turn in 2025 where I no longer believe that it's healthy or accurate to only call out the bad parts of a cult. I think that it's probably no coincidence that a lot of your resources, your resilience, and I'm talking about you, Eric and Jay, a lot of your intelligence, your resources, your community, your hard work ethic, your values, your vision are probably attributable to your mutual communities and ethics and values that shaped you all. It's just a guess, but if I were able to interview Eric and Jay, I'm guessing we're going to find a lot of parallels that mean that being raised in a high demand religion or cult has amazing blessings and goodness and opportunity, along with potentially horrific trauma and abuse. It's both. It's both. It's both.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. Well, I mean, yeah. And again, I mean, you obviously are the expert on the topic, and the parallels you drew in terms of early Mormonism and Joseph Smith to Stephen and Trina, which is, I think, I don't think you were comparing me and Eric and Jay to Joseph Smith.
No. Joseph Smith to Trina.
Yeah. So I understand what you were saying there, and I think that there's no denying it. It is weird that like your trauma can become your strong suit. That's what I'll say, right? And that's actually to some degree, it depends on what you do with it. Right. And that's where I always go back to some of my stoic sort of, followings now, because ultimately we are not what happens to us. We are what we choose to become. So I'm basically validating that I think there are parallels. There are fascinating ones, but ultimately there are also a lot of parallels of people who were disadvantaged and it hasn't necessarily worked out that way. And I don't want to in any way kind of, sound trite or dismissive of that, because I think that my story is a unique one, and it was definitely traumatic. There are definitely, a lot of things that went down where I feel like people were more disadvantaged than me, right? I actually think that there are a lot of young women in the collective who, we'll see what happens with my book. I think there's probably a reason to believe that my book is not the end of a chapter. It's the beginning of a new conversation. And I think a lot of people who want to tell their story will have the opportunity to do so. And I think that, so I guess I'm both validating and saying that for sure, there's a lot of people who can, objectively say like, hey, I was truly disadvantaged by this cult or my experience in X religion, right? And I think, but at the same time, I would hope, because I would agree in the end, that even with that being true, even as true as you make it, in the end, you are still what you choose to do with it, no matter what. There are things that happen and there are choices you make. And I think for whatever reason, I do choose to look at it. I mean, you've read my book, that in the end, I express gratitude for the fact that chess was made my purpose, that Stephen Camp had a crazy vision, that my mom did let me go. Those are things that fucked me up beyond repair and almost led to me destroying my own life and marriage and all kinds of shit in the process, right? But when I've gotten to the other side, like, I have to look at it and know, like, in hindsight, God damn it, the obstacle was the way, right? And there was something that was happening, and ultimately I don't change that because of where I got, but I can say that, again, we're back to opposing truths. I can say that while also not apologizing for my abusers. I can say that while still naming it for what it was. It was a cult. I can name it for what it was. I cannot apologize for my abusers. I can say that objectively this wasn't okay and it hurt me and I wouldn't let my kids go through it. But that doesn't mean I regret that it happened, because I have a perspective. I have a joy for life. I have a sense of gratitude that has come through the loss and the heartache of losing my mother. And we should probably get into that stuff. I have a perspective that I'm going to choose to share with the world in a way that I hope is helpful. Again, not to be trite, not to be dismissive, and not to say that there are those who I think had it even harder than I did, especially a lot of the young women. And it's hard. It's hard to hold those opposing truths because it's easier to be fucking pissed and to be angry. But I agree with you on that. And it is weird when you have parallels of people who've come to their own view on why they went through what they did is their choice, right? And hopefully they do good with it.
Yeah, and I want to move to the unraveling and to your reconciliation with your mom and other things, but for me, I like to kind of try and learn and draw parallels and distill. But what you mentioned, for example, in your book, is how Stephen Camp was always willing to help people who were down. And what you mentioned in your book is how valuable it is to be handed a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose, a source for spirituality, a community, a set of friends, resources that the community can invest in you, someone telling you you're worth something, someone telling you that they see potential in you, a resolution about the afterlife, a set of morals or values, an identity that helps structure you and give you that meaning or purpose. And that's, for better or for worse, what a healthy church and or a semi-healthy high-demand religion or cult or a toxic cult, all of them have one thing in common. They pretty much give you those things. And one of the biggest insights I have from your book, you said a cult works until it doesn't, right?
Yep.
And And that's different for different people.
Yeah.
So some people just have their experience in the cult and they're broken from the beginning, or some make it a few years and then they're broken. Other people write it for a lot of very, very positive, meaningful things along with trauma.
Yeah.
And overall, they're saying, I wouldn't trade it.
Yeah.
And then there's other people that probably just never stop benefiting from it and ride that all the way to their death, and they're super rich.
Which is unfortunate.
But it's unfortunate, but it's also the way the world works.
Yeah.
And so it's I love it that your book, and even now, it's recognizing that there's a reason why these things exist.
Yeah.
I think we as humans create them as much as we're deceived by them.
Yeah.
Because in the end, we need something. Because like we said, loneliness, meaninglessness, purposelessness, and no resources can actually be worse than a cult or a high demand religion. And so
Well said.
that's the paradox. So let's talk about the unraveling. When did the cracks start forming for you? And I know to some degree it was happening all along.
Yeah.
But when did you start questioning your faith? And then talk about the ultimate unraveling, if you're comfortable.
Oh, I'm comfortable.
And then we'll talk about the reconciliation with your mom. Because you were still in the collective several years into your marriage.
Into 2020.
Into the chess.com years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was still at times picking up the sword for the collective, and that's something you do, and you do it through the best framework you can of thinking you're doing the best you can, right? And so, again, you mentioned, several things there. I did see good that was being done both by Stephen Camp and the collective. I also saw bad, of course, but you justify and you kind of, you figure your way through some of those thought processes as you can, while also avoiding your own pain and issues and ruminating in hindsight and all that stuff. But I already kind of, said how I feel chess saved my life from the education it gave me, ultimately, for both good and bad. I would say that, in hindsight, others have said that when I was taken from my mom the way that I was, that for them, like, that was actually their moment. And I've had even, a woman who would go nameless, that to her, it was like a bomb went off in the collective, and it was like, oh, shit. This had happened other times with older kids, but it was never the same way. It was like 16-year-olds choosing new parents or changing their name or whatever. It wasn't like this. And so this was something that for others was a huge moment, right? And so for me, I think that there were definitely times of seeing, in hindsight, hypocrisy, abuse, like this wasn't okay. This was a mismanagement of money. That doesn't seem fair. That's not the right, whatever that is. But I would say there were two things that happened for me. One was the amount of times my own relationship with Shauna, my own marriage, began to be threatened with the idea that, well, if you guys aren't in the teaching, you might as well break up because you were put together in the teaching. So if you're not living the teaching, let's just call it what it is and get divorced. That was like maybe the most PG way it was said. It was like, hey, like, I can split you up. I can split up your marriage if you're not gonna get in line here or whatever, right? And that was not unique to just me. A lot of people had those experiences, right? And so what's funny is that as a thing, John, had already been done with our parents, right? People had been taken apart and put together with other people, right?
Whole out of...
Yeah. And so what I'm saying is, what's funny is I now see with clarity, this was always going to happen because Stephen and Trina Camp had already run this playbook and it worked with their peers. So why wasn't it going to work with the kids who were born in the teaching? I think what they misunderstood is the kids who were born in the collective one had not signed the covert contracts in the way that the parents had. They had not joined the collective. They were born into it. And I see that now, with so much more clarity because I've done so much self-reflecting, so much processing to not just prepare for these moments, but write a book and to do the thing I'm doing. And so I've been like that makes more sense to me now. The reason this was rejected was not just because people do want to have their own experiences. They want to go make their own money and find who they are before they commit to a cult. And they had been born into it, so we had never done that. But also, they were going to run the same playbook because they didn't know any better. They were going to try to do the same shit with us that they did with our parents.
They were going to like vibration.
And they literally did. They like vibration to everybody. They did things. And so in hindsight, we were always going to reject it, but they were going to do it anyway because there was no other game plan. And so when my marriage started to be threatened in the same way, that was never okay. And it was through different means. It could have been through money conversations, through this conversation. But when I was being asked to like give Stephen Camp money to make sure it was okay that me and Shauna could stay together, because now that we were having sex, we had to get married. And I saw how much he was double dipping in my own life when I was making money with chess. It was like, this isn't good, but I have to do it to make sure he doesn't take me away from Shauna. So that never felt good. But then the second thing that happened was the story I share around my own kids. When I had my own kids, and at some point there was a conversation where I was basically threatened, through lack of a better word, that one of my kids was not my spiritual kid, which was implying directly that they could be taken from me or they might choose new parents.
Which would strike you at your hardest heart, right?
Which struck me deep, right? And again, I'm not sharing all of that because I think that's already enough and people should want to read the book for that. But that experience of seeing what would happen if my kids were taken from me, and just the natural visceral reaction of like, oh, no, motherfucker, this ain't happening. Like, I ain't doing this shit, right? And the moment that happened...
You're not taking my kids away from me.
That was it, right? Yeah. And so I think that those were probably the two biggest. So what's crazy is that even with that, though, I still stayed in the collective for a long time. And there are a lot of, church-going folk and a lot of reasons to stay a part of something that you have inertia with, you have relationships with, and at times you still experience the best of, right? And so my wife became a teacher at the Shelby School, and together, I ran a Boy Scout troop, by the way, and a Cub Scout pack. We were the only non-LDS in the area, by the way. We were the only non-denominational troop and pack because it was so good for the kids. We had tons of kids living below the poverty line at the Shelby School. At this point, the school had a charter and it opened up to non-community kids, and so we were involved in a lot of kids' lives who we were making a difference. We were making a huge difference, and tithing to the church, in my mind, which I tithed 10% to the Church of Immortal Consciousness until I left. I saw the good that it was doing, right? It was supporting the school, and the school supported these kids. I was literally losing money in order to allow my wife to teach at the school. Like, because I was making enough money now at chess.com, where 10% of my income was like a lot of money for the people in the collective, right? And for the school and for Stephen and Trina.
As we're saying, you were giving camp like 30% on top of the 10%, right?
Early on I was, not at that time. I was early on. I
don't want people to think that was the only fee.
Yes, I and that I kind of skipped past that because I was just sort of framing the things that kind of those are things I would list in the bullet list of sub hypocrisies that I saw, because they weren't even as big as my marriage being threatened or my kids being taken. But so the school is doing as well as it can. I'm all in on the idea that we're making a difference, and I stand by that. And we did a lot of good things, and my wife and I feel really good about the differences we made, and I would do a lot of that again if it was meant to be. It's so funny what happened in the multiverse. If then COVID hits, the school shuts down, my wife is home, and chess.com is doing this, and well, we skip past the fact that my mom, had, I guess there's a third edifice, and that's what before I get into what happened with that, let's back up and say, because at this point, the other big twist, unfortunately, there is not a happy ending in my relationship with my mom, because my marriage being threatened and my kids maybe being taken were two of the things. But the other probably biggest sort of, nail in the coffin was that not long after reconciling with my mom and doing the work that was a very traumatic healing and getting her not just back in my life, but for the year and a half to 2 years that I had her, she was my kid's grandma, and we had the relationship that I thought we were going to have forever. And one conversation turned out to be basically the last one I had with my mom, and she had a massive stroke. And she did have time in nursing homes, and it wasn't an immediate death, but a lot of the neurologists said like she probably should have died. The size of the subdural hematoma was more than a quarter. It was a huge stroke. And so she was never the same. We spent the next year and a half, 2 years, me and Josh and Noelle bouncing her around, but ultimately she died. And what happened during that experience was just, and I'm careful with this only because I love so many people who ultimately, even though I love them, I would say they also kind of fell short in terms of what I hoped to happen. What I thought was going to be the reality of a collective being there for you when it mattered most turned into a couple things that I have now coined, and my wife always jokes about them because I make everything a rhyme, which is I saw a bunch of people who were addicted to drama but didn't know how to deal with trauma. Suddenly I was the most mature person in the room in a group of a bunch of adults, and it was like this is real shit. And like you have a lot of people making it about them. I mean, even like competing over who has the worst health problems. It was like the lack of awareness about what happened and the lack of support was devastating and heartbreaking. And I think a lot of people were doing their best with a very traumatic situation where one of their best friends also was dying young. My mom had her stroke at 62. So I'm saying that not just because you can tell I'm obviously a very nuanced person to the point where I've been called a cult apologist by people, but I've also been someone who I stand by how I've handled a lot of things because I like to believe in the best of people wherever I can and not attribute motivation. But it was fucked up. We didn't have the support that I thought we were going to have. And it just put on blast the parts of the collective that were always a lie. And that, as you kind of mentioned early on, and I wrote about in my book, you saw that when things go well, it's the reason that the collective exists. It's because of the collective and the spiritual mission that you do well. It's because of your faith. But when it didn't go well, it's because your faith isn't good enough. Your faith isn't strong enough. And I saw that weaponized and abused with my mom. And that was kind of it for me, directly with Stephen and Trina in many ways. And now I'm going to go back, because, of avoiding the crying. And I've talked about this enough to know that, like, with my mom, healing that relationship literally saved my marriage, because it's not simple to say that when your mom doesn't fight for you and you ultimately are then told a lot of reasons why she didn't fight you because she wasn't good enough, and ultimately you become to believe a lot of bad things about your mom, it's not like that misogyny just goes away. And one of the things I wrote about in my book that I stood by, which is I wasn't going to write this unless I was going to go all the way, which was the reason my marriage was falling apart at its core. I was a very hurt human being. I was wounded. I've forgiven myself for this, but I was an asshole. And I was a misogynist at my core because I didn't respect women. That's the actual definition. Now, misogyny has varying levels, right? I was never physical or even really verbally abused. I was mentally, and I was manipulative with her for sure. I weaponized the teaching, and I was abusive in other ways that I do write about in the book. But I was a misogynist because I didn't respect women. And I didn't respect women because I didn't respect my mother, because she didn't do right by me. And again, it took years of healing, and it took my mom showing the courage to take responsibility in a way that when someone takes responsibility for that level of pain, when you objectively know that a lot of things were probably outside of their control, it pretty much disarms you. And if you're not someone who gets disarmed by that, it's probably a you problem at that point, right? And so healing my relationship with my mom and being disarmed in the way that I was, and then to lose her as quickly as I did to the stroke, and to not have the collective there, it was it changed everything very quickly. And even though we did stick around and I did tithe and there were good parts of it, and you love people and you have relationships with people you grew up with, with clarity, you see it for what it was. It was never going to be the same. So yes, I was choosing to live in the eye of the hurricane, but I was aware that it was a hurricane, and I was trying to be as calm as I could for my family in the middle of this. And then the pandemic hit, and the last thing I'll share, because I don't want to share more of my wife's story, but it is in the book, that then the real final nail in the coffin was that probably the last reason for us to really be there was that Shauna's mom was still in Arizona. She wasn't in the collective. She had left the collective and been in the valley. We were still kind of figuring out how to live in the eye of the hurricane. But Shauna's mom was diagnosed in February of 2020 with stage 4 breast cancer, and she was dead in June. And so it was like very quick, and her mom died at 62. So I had lost my mom at 64, stroke at 62. Shauna's mom was gone. We were two heartbroken, orphan kids who married each other, and then, it was time to move on. And that was basically, when it happened. And I had my final blow up with Stephen Camp that I write about in the book. And that also taught me a lot about what and why I was still around. I think in many ways, regardless of the other seeing good, I was also still there because I was a broken kid too, who wanted to believe that the lie was true, that he did love me more than other things, right? And I'm not saying he didn't, or that he doesn't now. I don't know, but I know that he doesn't know how to show it, and I know that he's a very damaged person, and I know that he has a lot of behavior that would say that maybe a lot more of this was more premeditated and manipulative than I saw, because in this moment where, he tried to really use the questioning thing to get me to write the covert contract one more time around this sort of "are we family or not" interaction that I share in the book, led to me
You basically were letting him know you couldn't keep writing the check. You were
and that was kind of it. That was it.
The monthly check.
When he did that.
Do you want to tell that story, or do you want to leave?
Sure, I can share the story, which is just that Shauna's mom had been diagnosed with breast cancer. This was, I think, now March, April. Things are not going well. Shauna's not doing well. I don't know that we knew she was going to die yet, but I had not been delivering Stephen and Trina tithe checks for quite some time. In fact, I probably hadn't talked to Stephen at that point for almost a year, even though we were still supporting and the school was still there and we were doing the best we could to navigate. And Shauna wasn't doing well, so I was like, honey, I'll take him the tithe check. And I was able to do it. At this point, I had done a lot of spiritual and mental Jedi. I had been in therapy for almost 4 years. I started therapy kind of right after my mom died in 2016. So almost 4 years I had been in therapy. And so I'm still a damaged, hurt little kid. I will not pretend to be something I'm not, but I was not afraid, and I was okay of dealing with the situation. And so Shauna, who had been kind of dealing with them because it was just an easier way for us to do life, and probably it was good that I was avoiding them, because probably in hindsight, the moment I was going to deal with them was the moment it was going to be the end. So maybe I was avoiding them subconsciously for a reason, right? And so Shauna wasn't doing well, and so I drove down in our Arctic Cat, kind of a, an off-road vehicle, and walked in and gave them the check, and Stephen tried to hand me back a box, and I looked in the box, and the box was full of all the pictures of my family and all the holiday cards we had given them over the years, everything that connected us to them, because at this point I was calling him Grandpa. Remember, I'm Stephen Marlowe's kid, and so we had a lot of good, or at least I thought, in our relationship too, even though I've been avoiding a lot of stuff, all the bad. And when he handed me back the box of pictures, and I'm like, what is this? Like, why are you doing this? And he was like, well, are we still family? Like, we're not really family anymore, right? Are we still family?
He was asking that why? Because you were giving him money.
Yes, I had still been giving him tithe check, but it was like a gambit, because again, this is like literally one of like the 48 laws of power, and like that fucking book about how to manipulate people. You don't say I miss you. You find a way to ask a question to get them to reprostrate themselves to the relationship, because that's a more powerful bond, right? You get them to sign a covert contract, because the other answer I could have given was, of course we're family. I'm sorry I've been gone. I'm sorry I haven't seen you in a year. This has just been hard stuff. Of course, why would you say that? No, keep the pictures. Of course we're family. In fact, I'll start coming to see you more. In fact, you want to have a drink tonight? Let's get together tonight. Like, that is the thing I had seen many people do with him many times over. But instead, that gambit backfired.
You were done. You were done playing that game.
Yeah, and I used the term gambit, I guess, accidentally with chess, but it was a gambit. He was trying to like see if he could lure me back in, and I lost my mind. And everything else that happened then, I write about in the book, which is that wasn't the last conversation we had, because as I wrote, I did, after we moved to Utah, go back one more time to handle storage unit stuff, and we had kind of an intense interaction that was closing but intense. But really that was it. The jig was up, and crazy enough, Eric and Amy, Eric is my co-founder at chess.com, the CEO, and his wife, Amy, they were moving to Salt Lake City, and Eric and I were breaking COVID restrictions, guilty. We were seeing each other in August of 2020. And we were actually on a run, and Eric was like, hey, like, Amy and I are getting out of California, a lot of stuff happening for us. Again, won't tell their story, but they're like, we're moving to Salt Lake because Amy's got family here, and I'm like, wow, big move for you. That's crazy, man. And he's like, you should come. I'm like, that's crazy. Yes, both of our moms just died, because Kathy had died in June and this is August. But my wife would never go for that. I go home and say, honey, like, Eric threw out this idea, and she was like, that sounds crazy. Like, why don't we do a road trip? So we went on a road trip in September of 2020, and we bought a house in Utah in October 2020. And that was a wild thing. And we are obviously very fortunate that we were even able to do that. But we were, and yeah, that's the fast and furious version of what went down.
And what was it like to finally leave? Was it hard? Was it just all euphoric and positive? Was it mixed?
It was, to this day, one of the hardest experiences of my life, but not for the reasons you would totally expect. Not because it was like, there was so much that had happened. Everybody, even people, there are so many people I know who are dispersed from the collective all over the Southwest, people who, in the varying degrees of still wish it was going, to like, it's the most evil cult that ever happened in the world or whatever. Like, to the varying degrees of people sit, I know people are going to hear this and have their own experience of how and when they left and different things. But I know that, I think for me and people who were still there at the time, there was so much denial going on about what this really was and how heartbreaking what we had seen fall apart. No matter how angry you were in denial about some aspects of it. And so many relationships were just not good anymore. And then what happened is so we didn't actually move till end of December, January 2020, even though we bought the house. I got COVID, and I got COVID bad. I lost my whole sense of smell for a very long time, which, by the way, was like, I didn't realize I'm a very sensory person, maybe because I've lost my hearing. I love that I can smell things. And it was one of the most, I was so depressed. I had heavy COVID in December. I couldn't smell anything. Everything had lost its like motivation and taste. I don't think I read about this in the book, actually.
No, you don't.
And so what happened was I had horrible COVID. And so in addition to the fact that relationships were bad, like no one could come help me anyway because I had COVID. And so my boys, we've moved to Utah, and Nash is a very late bloomer. He's now 6'1". He's a monster. I don't know how he got so big. But Nash and Warner were both little. So it was a very limited experience for them to help me. So I packed up our entire fucking house, depressed, exhausted, like withered and lethargic, with my two boys, basically by myself over like, we had to extend how long we had the U-Haul for because I couldn't get it done because I was just so depleted and exhausted, and it was so devastating, and there was nobody there. There was no support. There was no love. Even if there could have been, they couldn't because of COVID, even if they wanted to. It was the worst. And then we drove out of the village and, eventually would sell our houses and the house that we had there. And, yeah.
So you lost family, you lost community, you lost a mentor or two or three. Were you still having access
lost a couple of moms? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Were you still having access to Durran at that point, or had you stopped?
Not really at that point.
Okay.
But not too much previously. And I touch on this a little bit in the book in terms of, giving the perspective I do about how I've come to terms with the experience of spirit, of there being higher consciousnesses that exist, of your own higher consciousness and consciousness without the body. And how did I get here? What do I believe? And I'll let people read the book to figure out some of that. But I would say that I was openly able to be skeptical, but still experiencing what I liked out of it. And I think that in hindsight, that experience was probably also unique and probably also something that Chess and my wife gave me, because I think when it comes to people's relationships with churches and faith, and I'm saying this not to speak for experience that are my own, but I've had a lot of people tell me this, that a big part of like, you avoid questioning anything, because if you question one thing, you're actually secretly afraid you'll start questioning everything.
Yeah, you pull the thread.
And so you pull the thread, and so you're afraid. Yeah. And I think what I would encourage any religious infrastructure, any denomination to understand, and I've actually said this openly, that my big problem with the religion is that they often try to fight dogma with dogma. They try to fight skepticism with black and white, ye have little faith in doing this. And I would actually argue if someone's relationship with God or a faith or a way of thinking is meant to be, it is only strengthened through tearing the muscle. Just like anything else, if you tear the muscle and rebuild it because of your own reasons and you reconstruct what you have deconstructed, you may find that what you do hold on to is more valuable to you than it was before. But religions lose people because they don't allow space for people to go through the gray and the nuance and the fear and the skepticisms and the loss that happens naturally because we're all dealing with hard shit. And so I, for whatever reason, had an experience where I did go through that. I lost my mom and didn't have support, but I still went to trances and I saw certain things that I saw were so good. I gave myself agency to say that trance wasn't real. That was Trina's bullshit. That trance wasn't real. Trina was drunk. Nobody in the collective was allowing themselves to say that while it was obviously happening. I gave myself the agency to say that, which in turn, ironically, allowed me to be like, I actually do think that part of Durran's teaching is super fucking healthy. I actually think that is a very good principle. I think that part of Stephen Camp, even though I've seen him manipulate people, was actually okay. And so I'm saying it whether, I think that a lot of people lose their way because they are not allowed to explore skepticism in the middle of crisis. And so instead you develop wounds that you're ignoring, right? And I think either because I had been exposed to the world or because my wife was always kind of doing that way. She was ahead of me on that because of her experience. And because I was okay with that. And I didn't judge myself, but a lot of people judge themselves if they feel like they're losing their faith, right? And so that is how I've explained to people who have questioned, why were you still there when this was obviously a lie? And I say, well, there were a lot of lies. There were a lot of fraudulent behavior. There were things that weren't okay, but there were also things that were going on that were good. And I was able to live in the eye of the hurricane probably because I gave myself the agency to do it. And so that was what was happening. And so there were some trances. There were some not good trances. Even if you believe all trance is fake, if you're someone watching it and think that I'm a crazy person and that's your own, you can feel that way. Regardless of what you believe about the source, I was obviously able to discern what I thought was good or not. And because I was doing that in a way that I felt was healthy, was good. Although I will acknowledge now that having written the book, I entered into the book thinking I knew what every one of the babies were and what all the bathwater was. I will acknowledge that I have changed some of that. I have deconstructed even further in terms of my own views of something that I thought was good, and I'm like, actually, that shit was fucked up. That actually was never okay. Or, no, Stephen Camp was trying to do good there. Actually, I think that was actually way more premeditated than I realized. So I will acknowledge that even in this process, I have changed my own views on some stuff, but I've probably also put some things in bathwater, at least a little more in the gray, and I think that's been my experience with this. And it's been crazy. And that's, I guess I'll leave it at that.
No. And what I hear you saying are two things. And I'm hearing you say, the experience that you had was great in many ways and horrific in many ways. And it was both. So you're giving yourself permission to own, embrace, lean into the whole of the experience, which I think is not only probably healthy, it's also probably true in some sense, that you got a lot of good and a lot of harm.
Yeah.
So what good does it do you or anyone to deny the good? That just puts you in a place where you're not dealing with reality, but it's also critical that you could also call out the bad. But also what I also hear you saying is for your healing and growth, you've allowed yourself to keep the good. In other words, you're not, there's some people who when they are A, B, and C in a high demand religion, once they decide it was harmful or no longer good anymore, then they just sort of either consciously or unconsciously conclude, well, that I can't be A, B, or C anymore. So I need to be X, Y, and Z, but never A, B, and C. But I think what's most healthy and integrated is to say, you know what? A and B were actually okay. Now C was fucked up, and I'll leave D, E, and F on the table as bathwater. But I'll keep A, B, R, and Z because they were phenomenally healthy, and I'll bring those with me, not become the inverse negative of whatever I experienced, but instead bring the good and then add more good and hopefully become a healthier and a happier person afterwards versus becoming the negative instantiation of whatever I came from, which I think wrecks a lot of people, honestly.
I mean, you said it well, and I agree, and it's a normal, and I will say, like, everyone's process, to use a word that everyone's journey in that is its own process, and everyone has the right to it, right? I think that, sometimes you have to find yourself by hitting the guardrails and being angry or extreme about something. But I think in the end, I meant what I said, and it is not something I invented, but it is true that anger and hatred are drinking poison and expecting other people to feel differently. I mean, these days, there's more and more scientific proof that it literally affects your cellular structure and way of being, whether you like it or not. So it's good to do certain work. And, one analogy I've used when it comes to rethinking some of this stuff is before you get really on it about anything, consider that once you start a thought process, it's a lot like grabbing a pendulum and going here. And when you let go, what happens? It has to go to a pendulum doesn't go from here to being healthy and balanced again. it takes some time, right? And like, so every time you're in one of those debates, or as I say, religions fight dogma with dogma, you get, I don't know, it can become hard to recover from feeling so angry and so heartbroken, even though I've been there, right? And so I've tried to be like, before I grab it and go here with this thought, let me do the best I can. Because even if you just go a little bit, at least that's a little bit more. Like the balance finds itself faster than the extreme of bouncing around. And that's just been my own experience of how to handle, you know, when I try on these different thoughts and review things that have bothered me, or, you know, come to new perspective about stuff. And, you know, obviously you got to do the mental health work. If you're a damaged brain individual, it is mental health is a verb. It is not a noun. You do not achieve it and check it off. You have to do it all the time, right? And so I keep doing that as well.
Let me just ask you, I find addiction to substances being extraordinarily common in 2025 with my peer group, but even more pronounced with kind of younger generations, 20s and 30s.
Yeah.
So for someone who's in the throes of alcohol addiction, cannabis addiction, or any other type of substance addiction, or let's just say any addiction at all, what tips can you offer to starting to address and or conquer substance addiction?
That's a big one, and I want to be careful about it because I also want to acknowledge I'm not a professional, right? I can only speak from my experience. I know that goes without saying, but I want to say it anyway because I really mean it. Like, I think that obviously everyone has their own road in terms of how they got there. But the first thought that came up for me is like, every behavior has a why. It has an underlying reason that it got there. And that is true with porn addictions. It is true with drug addictions. It is true with anything. And I think, just like every good mission, every good purpose should have a why. There should be a why you do anything you do. And hopefully that why is about service and about connection and about things that are good. And then the job takes place from that. That's kind of what I've learned about purpose in terms of someone who had purpose weaponized against him. Chess was never a purpose. Chess was a thing I did, but the why I do it should be about connecting with people and serving them and the benefits I've seen the game give to their brain or whatever. Like, there are whys that manifest into what you do. And I would say on the inverse of the bad things that you do, or the things that you don't like about your behavior, to say that, because I actually don't think anyone should think of themselves as bad. I think that's part of the problem. I think the bad whys that you're afraid of looking at are often the reason you can't get out of the behavior. And so what I would say I learned is that you're not bad. There are no bad whys. And that the fear you have about getting into why you started because you don't want to look at that is actually the thing that keeps you from being able to quit the problem. And so I have now written a book and openly talked about the fact that I was a misogynist. How many people would avoid saying that they lacked respect for women? I think there are many men in the world who would benefit from just acknowledging that we are conditioned to objectify, to have expectations, to hold to standards, and then judge and evaluate women about behavior that is not only worldly conditioned, and then you have any personal relationship where a woman did you wrong. And a lot of men justify, you know, I would say misogynistic behavior or thought processes about this stuff. And like, I now say it because I'm not afraid of my whys. And I think I spent many years not thinking that I was God, that I was good, that I was love, that I was wholesome, because I was a broken kid whose dad like left his mom, basically was like given a scarlet letter and told you're not anything in this world, and then developed all kinds of like, you know, accolades and kudos around external performance and behavior. And it led to like a really fucked up sense of self in addition to lacking respect for women. And I became a fucking asshole. And I was struggling. I was not a fucking asshole. I became a fucking asshole, right? And I think that's the language I use, because my wife is always very big on, she doesn't like it when I use language that is self-judging, because she corrects me. And that's why she's becoming a therapist, because she feels very strongly about helping people solve these problems. And what I would say is like, for me, and again, some addictions are worse than others. And I was at a point where I needed antidepressants. I was on Zoloft for many years. I needed real therapy and real help. I needed real exercise. I needed things that jump-started my battery. And there are people who get in spots where you need real things. I'm not saying that you listen to this podcast and, oh, Danny talked about the why, and that fixes it. Not at all, right? I think that there are times when I needed I needed antidepressants and serotonin to help my broken brain deal with the parts of me that was not just self-judging, but couldn't make sense of a world where I was depressed and had lacked safety and had lacked feelings that I was ever good for such a long time that I needed real help. But at the end of getting that real help, when I started to be able to unpack this stuff, what I found was that the reasons I had developed these behaviors is because I thought I was bad. I thought I had failed. I thought that I was just going to be a jerk. I thought that I wasn't actually worthy of love. I thought that there were these things that were wrong with me. And what I realized is, like, being able to say that I had misogynistic behavior and some things that I did doesn't make me a horrible person. It actually doesn't. In fact, more people should be willing to talk about their flaws, because the lack of awareness about it is usually the first step toward behavior that you've developed to cover it up. Because a lot of whys that even become bad are good. Like, a lot of young men can develop addictions to porn because they're figuring out their body and they're horny, like, for lack of a better way to put it, and they don't know what to do with it, and they're not being talked to because their dad is also struggling with sex shame issues, right? Like, these are the whys that no one's talking about. And now they're manifesting in this way. And so if you don't want to talk about the why, you have a hard time fixing the behavior. You can take drugs for it. You can try to avoid it. You can self-judge yourself. But a lot of times that behavior will keep coming back unless you just start with, why did I get there? And so what my challenge would be, don't be afraid of the why. You are good. Everybody is a child. Everybody is love. Everybody is good at their core. And if you remember that and are willing to face down the whys that got you there, I would say that for me, that was the necessary step to, if we want to call it, fixing the bad behavior that I had. Because I was never bad. I had bad behavior. And that's what I would say.
That plus psychiatry and psychology, right?
Okay. Getting help. I talked about that. Yes, I've had therapy.
No. I'm repeating.
Yeah.
How you started.
Yes, and
just
again,
for emphasis, not because
therapy,
you didn't.
If you need help, and again, exercise changed my life. I was on antidepressants for a long time. I'm no longer on antidepressants, and that's been amazing that I was able to get off of them.
Yeah.
And again, connection, community, family, having people in your life who you feel safe enough to talk about these things with you. There are a lot of sub bullets. I was just getting to the core of my answer, which is when I stopped running from myself because I realized I was afraid of actually looking at these things, it changed everything in terms of not just being able to fix the problems, but my willingness to talk about it. And yeah.
And I also got from the book that Shauna directing you, and you mentioned this earlier in today's episode, Shauna directing you to repair things with your mom was also crucial.
Oh, true? Huge. And I talked about healing the relationship with my mom and what that did for me, and then unfortunately the sad ending that had with my mom. But all of that really came about because of my wife, because of Shauna's desire, which again, she was pushing me in many ways because I think she knew that I needed to heal that relationship to be a better husband and a better father. I
don't want to argue with you about your own story, but I saw your reconciliation with your mom as one of the triumphs of the book, not as a tragedy.
Oh, no, I don't see it that I meant it's tragic that she died as quickly as she did. Yes. That's what I meant. No, my relationship with my mom is I wrote in the book and I meant it. My wife is the hero of my story, but if the hero's journey got to something, it was my relationship with my mom, right? It was the journey to come back to and heal that relationship, and my mom being the hero that she was. It is a triumph that I think completely changed my view of everything. And she taught me what matters by taking responsibility for things that weren't even her fault, doing anything it took to heal my heart about what had happened. Just changed my perspective about valuing relationships over being right in a way that is like, it's funny because that's a phrase that was said in the teaching a lot, value relationships over being right, but she actually lived the teaching in a moment that was so difficult, where it's like she knew that to save this relationship, she had to consume all of my pain, even the things that she could have herself said, well, I did it because of this, and it was because of that. Like, we eventually got to a point where as an adult, I had compassion and understanding from my mom, and I still learn things now that give me perspective about the impossible situation she was in. But she was dealing with a hurt little kid who was fucking angry and who had been abused, and like, it wasn't time for that. And so many people like can't get their own shit out of the way to just take responsibility for for what you can to help heal another human being. And she did that at a level that, like, literally, like I said, it disarms me to this day to just think about the person that she was and the triumph that was us healing our relationship. And yeah, my wife, she knew that I needed to do that, and she pushed me to do it. I didn't want to, but she was right. And yeah.
What a beautiful story. Well, I want to give you a chance to talk about anything else you want to say about the book. I'm curious, like, how long it took you to write this book?
3.5 years.
3.5 years. And how many hours a week? Like, I've thought about writing sometimes. Like,
it was a lot, because there were different processes where I would record and then listen back, transcribe, audio. You know, you write things, you restructure things, you get feedback for things. Did you
consider a ghostwriter? And you don't have to answer that.
I had editors and collaborators in that process, right? And so there were people helping me in that way. And ultimately, you know, I wrote and rewrote and re-edited and read all the stuff, but I had collaborators helping me piece it together. And you know, some of the editors and collaborators were monumental in contributing to parts of the book that, you know, almost like a conversation, when you give someone else agency to kind of editorialize your life, as much as that sounds weird, and you can be like self-righteous and say, you don't get to fucking tell me about my life. But when you let people in and give them the perspective that you have, and then allow them to kind of to have an opinion about, well, it seems like this was your relationship with your dad and this and that. Sometimes at first the opinion goes, don't tell me that. And then you go, okay, well, that is actually true, but we're not going to write that. And then you go, okay, well, we are going to write it, but we're going to say it my way. And then you go, well, actually, the way you said it was pretty good, but let me change this, right? I mean, that's literally a process that would happen throughout the whole thing. And so yes, I had a lot of help, right, in that way. And I'm super grateful for that.
Well, I thought the book was incredibly well written. Well,
thank you. Yeah.
I don't read, books cover to cover in the amount of time that I did. I felt an instinct that I needed to, and I'm super glad I did.
Thank you. Well, it's been fun, and I think some of the best compliments I've gotten as the book is coming out. And I can't wait for your audience to read it and leave the comments, because I think two of the comments I've been really proud of. Obviously, it's a big story, and it was a heavy process for me to review. And at times, my therapist was mad that I was doing it, because she felt like I was re-traumatizing my brain, and it was a crazy thing to do over an almost 4-year period. But the two compliments I've loved the most were people who love the chess sections, who don't know anything about chess.
Yeah.
Who were like, you really did a good job helping me feel like I understood this incredible history of this world. So I'm like, yes, we did it, because that was something I really wanted to do. And then
you have little chess vignettes in between each chapter.
Yes, yeah.
You have these really cool chess vignettes that talk about AI.
They talk about cheating in chess. They talk about all the stuff.
We didn't even talk about the scandal.
We didn't talk about it. We don't have to unless you want to. But then the other thing is, and obviously there's a lot of behind the scenes about the scandal in the book. So, but the other thing was when people say, like, hey, you found a way to make it a page turner, even though it's a memoir, because a lot of memoirs, with no disparagement meant, are about the name of the person. People buy Will Smith's memoir because it's Will Smith or Barbara Streisand, right? And that's great. And I am not Will Smith or Barbara Streisand, not even close, right? And so I knew that I wanted to tell a story that I thought was interesting, right? For people to understand, in a bit of a cliffhanger way, right? I was like, hey, if we're going to do this, let's Tarantino it. Let's kind of bounce around a little bit. Let's kind of leave people hanging. And I think that committing to that idea that we were going to write it in a way that made it a page turner, and that the chess vignettes would help people understand our world, were two of the things that, regardless of my life, I feel really proud of. And I think I think it actually turned out well based on the feedback that we've gotten.
Absolutely. Well, just because we brought it up, and because my son mentioned it at the beginning, he's like, be careful how you deal with the cheating scandal, because like everyone and their dog, that's all they really care about. Yeah. So don't be thoughtful about that. Let's just flip it now for all the people that have no idea what we're even talking about. Yeah. But you want them to at least know about it. Is there anything you want to say about what we're talking about?
What I will say, and I think your son is a little too close to it, because he's a real chess fan, right? So he knows that everyone's talked about it, but I would bet a lot of your audience might know nothing about it.
I'm sure most don't, yeah.
So I will just say that one of the crazy things about writing my book is that my publisher, Hachette, had already committed to the idea that this was a great memoir because I was raised in a cult and accidentally found my way to the epicenter of chess because of it. But in the middle of writing the book in September of 2022, so almost 3 years ago as of today/tomorrow, the biggest scandal in the history of chess happened where Magnus Carlsen, the world champion at the time and the greatest player really ever to play, accused a young American of cheating. And chess.com and myself were caught right up in the middle of that because the fact is this kid had cheated on chess.com. I had personally handled that case and sort of kept it secret, but that didn't necessarily mean he had cheated here. And it forced all of these like cheating secrets into the open in the chess world. And then the way we handled it ultimately led to Hans Niemann, the young American, suing me and Magnus and others for $100 million. And the case was ultimately dismissed with prejudice, but it led to this crazy scandal, partly because, and I'll just leave it at this, what made it most viral, for those who do know it, are going to say, oh yeah, that was the kid with the anal beads. And that's a weird thing to say, but that's because what happened was somebody made up the idea, well, how could you cheat with hiding it? And someone's like, maybe he had anal beads, a sex toy with Bluetooth buzzing if he knew the chess piece. And that idea was retweeted by Elon Musk. And then it went on to The Tonight Show and The Daily Show, and it went viral with nobody fact-checking whether it was real or not.
I'm not sure the anal beads made the book.
It didn't. Okay, and that was partly by design because I actually didn't want to sensationalize that part of it because it was never fact, but everyone knows about this story. So what is in the book is the true story and my story and all the things. And the anal beads part of it is a massive part of what gave the scandal virality. But there's the whole behind the scenes of what happened there is in the book, and that is definitely something that I think the chess community has been waiting for.
And I loved, I'm not going to give anything away, but I love how compassionate you were, even to Hans, is that his name? Even Hans. I think it was beautiful to me how your upbringing led you to want to have compassion for Hans, even though he was causing you, some could say he was causing you and others a world of heartache. You still, I feel, dealt with Hans compassionately, empathetically, and respectfully, I think.
I appreciate that, and I would do that again. And I still feel that way today. And again, speaking of opposing truths, it's hard for many people in the chess world want to polarize what happened too. They want to make it black and white. So I'm not allowed to say that I have deep compassion for what Hans went through and the position that he was put in. And I can still say that he doesn't get to have his cake and eat it too, because he did cheat. He put himself in a spot to be there. And in a world that celebrates child prodigies, you don't get to say I was just a kid while you're playing the best in the world and winning thousands of dollars either, right? Basically, it's a really hard thing to be in because you want to have compassion, especially for young people, and to provide a path for second chances. And that's how we've operated. But you also have to be able to say the truth in these moments. And so I stand by it today. I wish the best for Hans. And I can say that while knowing that he did cheat, and he has continued to lie about the extent of it from my view and in the report that we wrote. And so it's an interesting thing. And I understand... I kind of understand why, and I understand that the dynamics are really hard for people to deal with this stuff. And so, anyway, I share all of that. I think people will probably be surprised that I feel that way because it was a lot, and he did accuse us of literally a federal crime and created a massive problem for everybody in the situation. And there was no conspiracy, and there was none of that shit that he was saying was happening. So that was hard. But he was in a tough situation too. So
one of the things I relate to, I feel like I entered the Mormon themed podcasting space with similar intentions of like really wanting to be a part of a solution, not only to helping my church get healthier and better, but also to helping a lot of people who I knew with the internet were going to be struggling with it. But one of the things I related to in your book, a negative way to spin it is no good deed goes unpunished. It's that sort of a cynical negative way to say you try and help and all you get are headaches and criticism and negativity in return. That's not how I actually see my history. It's more that if you play in a big space, especially in the internet world, you're not facing reality if you don't expect some real pain and difficulty. That just comes with the territory. And I found myself empathizing with the extent to which you have probably been criticized and or probably at times savaged over the years, when I got a real genuine sense that you only just wanted to make the chess world a better place. Is that a fair characterization of what you experienced?
It's more than fair. Yeah. And, you know, I've done a lot of work to try to be in the best mental health space about this, because it is super hard when you have, I mean, it's like these days if I do things in the chess community, there's a podcast I did that was an hour and 40-minute conversation with two very well-known top grandmasters. They have a great podcast. And literally, the video's been live for 13 minutes. You can see the timestamp. And there's already a comment, fuck this guy. I know Danny Rensch is evil. Chess.com is always lying. This guy's just a political mouthpiece. He couldn't have even watched the video. And the first 15 minutes of the interview were actually me and Fabiano joking around about like jokes I told when he was on the World Chess Championship coverage with me. Like, it's just crazy, right? Where people are, it is so obvious when you see it that what people say in that space is so much more about them and their experience. And I've learned to kind of come to terms with it in a couple ways, which is, one, people will often see in you the motivations or agendas they might have if they held your position. And people can take that for what they want. That maybe people reading that would be like, oh, that makes them angry. But often, if someone is very quick to cast aspersions, he who casts the first stone, it often says more about them than it does about a person they clearly know nothing about, let alone really the details of it, right? So the reality is, people only know to project what they would do if they were in your spot, or what they would have, which is for them to look at if they want to. And then the second thing that's given me peace about this is that people can't show great hate without great love. And that is not a secret way for me to say all my haters really love me. That's not an egomaniac thing to say. But what it is saying, no, it really is true, because what I realized is that they see me as having power over something they love. They see me as having influence over something they love. And what do people do when something they love is threatened? They get scared and they get defensive, and they sometimes act out. And so if people see me at chess.com as having influence or power, or in some way I am a more influential character than they are over this thing that they love, and they don't agree with one thing I said one time, or they think I'm at the epicenter of some scandal, they are reacting in fear to hate me. And again, that is on them, but it allows me in my framework, in my mental Jedi-ness, to say, I can love that person and have compassion for where they're at, because they hate me because they're afraid that I will do something wrong with something they love. And what they don't know is that I don't want to. I want to do good, and I want to do good by the game. And there's a lot of evidence that we've done a lot of really good, and that the truth is, usually they are actually more in the other bucket, and I'm looking the other way for them. They actually are probably someone who's an asshole and needs to look at some shit. If you're commenting on the internet with hatred and vitriol over people you don't even fucking know, it's like, come on. Like, that is usually not a good sign for your life. Anyone out there right now, I will say that if you're doing that to John, that's a problem, because often, like, that is about you. You don't really know the person. So they probably are more in that bucket than I would acknowledge, but I try to assume the best in everybody, and I can give everybody that. Often, maybe you were put in that position by people in the Mormon church, because, like, if you're embracing a conversation or inviting skepticism, there are people who will perceive that as you attacking something they love, and I think they will act in fear. And I have not listened to your, I'm just going to be honest, I don't know, right? And so I can't speak for you or not, but I can imagine that would be a difficult thing for people. And so it allows me to, like, have compassion when they're basically being idiots and assholes about what's actually going on, and they're making and casting dispersions at me, and they don't fucking know shit about me, let alone what I've been through in my child, let alone anything that actually drives me. And so, like, it hurts. And it's probably not healthy that it's become white noise when I get death threats, and I don't worry about it that much.
Which you have.
Which I have. I've had many. But at the same time, like, it goes, all right, like, this is what it is. Anyway, so that is the mental gymnastics that I have done to not want to run away screaming. And I also know that we've done a lot of good, or there wouldn't be people mad, because I have learned that when you grow the pie to that level, maybe in 2016, everybody who commented on Reddit loved Danny Rensch, but the pool was a lot smaller. Now it's a lot bigger, and with it has come a lot of people who go, fuck this guy, but really only because they think of me as the guy who runs the evil chess company, which isn't even evil. I use the app every day, but they shouldn't charge for any. I don't know, whatever it is, the story they tell themselves, right?
Yeah.
And so anyway, you kind of come to terms with it as best you can, and that's what I've done.
Yeah, beautiful. All right, this is my final substantive question, maybe. Do you? And this is from one person raised in a high demand religion / cult to another, who's also a father. Do you ever find yourself wishing that your own children could have parts of your upbringing?
100% every day.
But okay, I want to hear about that. And then the second part of the question is, like, if cults aren't the answer, do you ever think about like starting a new church? Not you personally, but like, how do we create a childhood and a teen and a formative experience, or for adults, a community of morals and values and ethics and purpose and meaning and spirituality and growth and healing? How do we create that without the toxic stuff, but still give our kids and ourselves and future generations all the good? Do you ever think about that type of stuff? And
I think about it all the time, unfortunately, because I now have adult children, because when you have a kid at 19/20, I have a 19, 20-year-old, and I'm not 40 yet. So I'll answer the first part first. There were aspects of serving others when I didn't want to. As a spoiled brat, we were taking care of the whole village and picking up trash and doing things that, even if there were times and there were people who abuse, again, in every infrastructure, there are people who are going to abuse it. And I was then, when I was orphaned in the valley, I was like made to pick fruit off the trees when it was 120 degrees heat, because Stephen Camp wasn't around to say no, and it wasn't okay.
You're cleaning bathrooms, right?
Yeah, all those things. But at the same time, like, the idea that my mom came down hard on me when I tried to have an attitude about serving older women in the collective, the fact that I was told that I will literally lose myself in the service of others, the fact that I learned at a young age to feel safe giving my opinion, even if then I learned to weaponize it and to process and do the things. Like, I learned to communicate and articulate in a way that I think social media and the way certain things are now, like, isn't that great in terms of, not just the idea that people can ghost people, but they can get out of big moments of confrontation and relationships without ever dealing with it. I think you lose things when you don't have real relationships. There's a lot that comes with the cult environment, but we're going to move past that, because we're going to say we talked about that. I'm just going to talk about the good and say you can't have your cake and eat it too, and that you can't expect people to be there for you unless they're there for you in the good and the bad. And I think that lack of community, lack of training around how to deal with big conversations, and lack of expectation on serving others at times is like, I look for ways to create those experiences for my kids and curate them, because there isn't a cult leader from on high saying to just do this, right? Or a hierarchy to compete with for attention and make your kids serve so that you look good, and whatever else came with that, right? And those are just a few off the top of my head. Like, there are things there that I really do wish were more a part of our life. And I don't know how to answer the second part, right? Because I'm not going to start a church. I'm not going to start a collective. And I'm not going to in any way pretend that I don't think even the process of certain parts of those things can, again, I've already said that I think helping people ask big questions is a super important thing you can do as a mentor. You can do it as a leader. You can help people feel supported and safe to deal with tough conversations and to encourage them to find their path and their purpose and their best thing. But you really have to do it without an agenda and without the pretense that you think you know the answer, because I've seen what happens the other way. And so I actually get afraid about the idea of having influence in a way where I would you have influence over your own kids and you do the best you can with that, but then eventually you don't anymore. You're not even the CEO anymore. You're like maybe on the board and you're hoping they come and consult you every once in a while, right?
Yes.
And so that relationship changes, right? And so I don't know how to answer it other than I have always come back around to the future of humanity is going to be saved by education, because what I believe in education, and unfortunately we live in a world where even the word education has become a polarized, weaponized political word, when fundamentally ignorance is the first step to bigotry. And ignorance, lack of appreciation for lack of understanding and lack of appreciation for how other people feel and why other people view things is the first step toward a biased perception, which is not bigotry yet. I'm just starting with a biased perception on you knowing better or being able to objectify their experience to some degree. And so many people judge other countries that they've never been to, or they judge other cultures that they really don't know other than what XY news station tells them. And they're all guilty of it, right? And they're weaponizing extreme beliefs on both sides. And I think I've looked at the internet with the hope that maybe at some point the internet, when we're not inheriting the legacy of our forefathers of, information as power and trying to weaponize fake news and agenda, maybe eventually access to how everyone else thinks and feels on the planet will, in a healthy way, break down barriers where people understand each other better. And instead of thinking everything about the Middle East, you will really have an understanding and feel it and empathize with it, right? And realize that maybe there's a lot of people who are kind of a lot like you, who really just want a family and to feel love and to be understood. And so my hope for humanity is that maybe in the future technology will actually shrink the world in a healthy way, will break down barriers that are basically just lack of understanding, ignorance, and that by being more educated about how other people feel, we maybe don't need the same governing bodies and infrastructures. Not that they can't exist, that religions and churches can't exist. People can choose their own adventure. But I'm a bit of a believer that maybe information, the internet, education, and kind of transcending these barriers instead of weaponizing them is kind of the future hope. And that is my message. Maybe I'm an optimist because I just am, and I believe that at some point we will stop weaponizing this. We will learn the power of what we have, and it'll be something that can bring a lot of great things to the planet instead of being this where we pick and choose what we're telling people and polarize and antagonize further. And cyber terrorism is a real thing, right? So that's my hope, that eventually it actually does provide education in a way that heals the planet versus tears it apart. Because otherwise I don't have an answer. But that's just my hope.
But you're not religious now. You guys didn't go to a new church or anything like that.
For lack of a non-New Agey way to say this, we're not religious, but we are spiritual. We do not attend any traditional denomination. We do not go to church. We do have some family traditions, use the term ritual if you want in a healthy way in terms of always taking Sunday to be together, take time to talk. Sometimes we'll read from the Daily Stoic. We'll read from Thich Nhat Hanh, Buddhist stuff. We'll have mindfulness affirmations. We'll watch an inspiring YouTube video about why you should put away your phone, kids, because it's bad for your brain. My wife and I are very big on educate your kids, even to the point of you think this might be above their level, but do it anyway. Because ultimately, first of all, they're way smarter than you think. They're way more observant than you think. And you would rather be the first source of information on shit, even if you're talking to your kids a little bit earlier than maybe you should. I'm just a big believer in that because I'm kind of unless we're going to run away and be Amish, I'm going to empower my kids and make them. And so I always have a thing. Oh, you want to watch Pulp Fiction? Then let's talk about drug abuse and sex. You ready? Let's go. Okay, you don't want to do that yet, then you're not ready for Pulp Fiction. No, Dad, I don't want to talk about that. Okay, well then you don't get to watch Pulp Fiction, right? But then when my teenage boys do, it's yeah, let's watch Pulp Fiction. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about what happened there, right? So that's my thing that I've tried to do, and obviously you do it with tact. I don't talk to my 9-year-old about Pulp Fiction. But I guess that's how we've handled it.
What about Django Unchained?
We've seen Django Unchained, but we I don't talk about that with my 9-year-old. So anyway, that's kind of how we've leaned into that, and we do have, my wife and I are existential, spiritual, stoic people. That's kind of how we operate in the space, and I don't focus so much on the why we're here, because the moment you do that, you're storytelling. No matter what religion you are, human beings create stories for good and for bad. I'm not saying it's bad, but they do create stories. I like to focus on the miracle of how we're here and the undeniable reality that at some point something did come from nothing, and the existence of self-awareness and consciousness to me is an undeniable thing. And I have developed my own spiritual framework through a lot of religious and reading and stuff that I won't get into now because people are probably sick of me at this point. But yeah, I have my own spiritual views on stuff, and I do believe in consciousness beyond the body is a thing, and that it's undeniable that we are here and that that's a miracle. But I don't like wrap storytelling frameworks around it where possible. And so that'll be the quickest way to say what I believe and what we teach our kids, with a lot of encouragement for them to figure out what they believe too. So that's us.
I love it. How many books does the Mormon Stories community need to collectively buy to maybe get you and maybe Shauna back to do a Q&A kind of book club thing?
Oh man. I mean,
5,000, 10,000?
That is a good one. So I told Shauna that you wanted, or you invited her to come, and she's like, I don't want to do it alone. I'm like, no, you come with me. And like, it was, she's been on podcasts before, but it's just not as much her thing, but I think she would. So I'll, whatever they want to buy, we'll call it 5,000 if you let me put a number on it.
All right, Mormon Stories community. I know that 100,000 plus people are going to at least see this interview. Freaking 5,000 of you, all of you, half of you, buy this book. The book is Dark Squares, How Chess Saved My Life. Danny Rensch, one of the co-founders of chess.com. Buy this book, buy 5, buy 10, give it to your friends and family. Let's make this a super big seller out of the gate. Not just because this book deserves to sell well, but because you will love this book. I swear to Thich Nhat Hanh that what you heard in today's podcast is a single-digit fraction of the wisdom and the information and the coolness that you will find in this book. So this podcast represents an augmentation of what you will read in the book, not a replacement for what you'll find in the book. The book is worth it. Get it to transform your life, to learn more about your own cult or your own high demand religion or your own abusive relationship or whatever it is. Get the book, heal, grow, learn from it. And then when the overwhelming number of people buying this book from this podcast manifests itself, then we'll have Danny and Shauna back for part 2. And we'll do a Q&A where we'll do a live stream, and y'all can, we'll let you come on the StreamYard and actually live ask your questions to Danny and Shauna.
That could be fun.
That'd be fun?
Well, first of all, that was amazing. Thank you, John. And I didn't expect the endorsement. I should have asked for 20,000 because I think you're going to get it. No, there you go.
We'll get it.
I really appreciate it. Thank you for having me. And I'm actually excited to come back. So I hope everyone does. And I've been nervous. I've been scared. Imposter syndrome doesn't even begin to cut it. Doing the best. So I hope to be back with my amazing better half. And I'm really grateful for you to have me on here.
Well, also, thank you for coming on the podcast. Thank you for writing this book. But also, like, I wanted my son to like chess. I tried to teach him chess. Yeah, I'm at a family reunion just last month, and my son's like, Dad, come on, let's play chess. That wasn't my doing. That was in spite of however I tried to teach my son chess. Something you and Eric and Jay, shout out to Jay and Eric and all the good people at chess.com and in the broader chess community. Like, I'm happy that my son and my daughter, Clara, and even my daughter, Maya, are all interested in chess. Like, y'all collectively did that, and it makes me happy, and it gives us happy moments, and I think it's good for my kids. So thank you, Jay, Eric, chess.com people, broader chess community, for enhancing something that is undeniably a positive contribution to humanity. Thank you.
Thank you for saying that. Seriously. It became a thing we started saying, and then unfortunately, when you become a big business, people weaponize what you say as that's just a big corporate. I've been called the evil chess popularist. I've been called Mr. Big Chess, but I'm going to say the phrase that we have said, and we said it before it was a thing, which is chess makes people smarter, and smarter people make the world a better place. So if you want to talk about an infinite mission, our mission is pretty awesome because chess is great. It's good for people. And there's a lot of studies about this, right? It fights off memory loss. It improves cognitive development for young kids. Like, there are so many things about it that are just fundamentally good for the brain and for people, in addition to it being fun and all the things that it used to be told it wasn't enough, but now people love it. And so there's a part of us that feel like sometimes Eric and I have to check ourselves because we feel so exhausted and we have to go, oh my God, we're kind of just at the beginning here. Like, chess is like, it is good for people and good people do good things. Like, we have to keep doing this. Like, this is good. So thank you for saying that, because it does fill our cup. And the fact that chess got cool somehow, like we're happy to be a part of it. And I'm glad your kids are doing it, and go chess, go team.
All right. Thanks again. The book is Dark Squares, How Chess Saved My Life by Danny Rensch. Buy it, enjoy it, share it with others. Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Stories. Thanks to Brooklyn and Julia and Margie and everyone at the Open Stories Foundation that makes all this possible. Thank you for the donors that make Mormon Stories podcast possible. We couldn't do this without you. So if you're a donor, we've got like 1,500 donors in the world, weirdly. Thank you to those who donate, even though hundreds of thousands of people enjoy this podcast. Millions, weirdly, about 1,500 people donate. But thank you to those who do. We couldn't do it without you. If you valued this show, if you're new to this show, if you value this content and you want to see it continue, we lose donors every month. Please become a monthly donor or an annual donor and subscriber. That's how we pay the bills. Ad revenue is in decline on YouTube and elsewhere, but we're grateful that we rely on donor support. So please support us if you can. Go to mormonstories.org, click on the donate button, become a monthly donor. That's how we do it. And then also you can help us by subscribing, liking, commenting, sharing, and also by providing us with your feedback. mormonstories@gmail.com. That's how we hear from you. In addition, we read every comment on YouTube and on Spotify. So you can help us in all those ways. Don't feel bad if you can't donate or contribute. But those ways of subscribing, liking, commenting, sharing are all ways you can help without spending a penny. So thanks to everyone who makes this possible. Thanks again, Danny. Anything you want to say to finish up?
No.
We went 4 hours, basically.
Just appreciation for having me.
All right.
And,
well, good luck with this book. I'm sure. Are you going to go on a big press tour? Are you going to be on Good Morning America?
It's beginning, and it's going to be a really busy first couple months. And when it comes to media stuff, you don't know what's going to happen after that until it gets going. You know what I mean? So there may be more, and hopefully people buy the book and it resonates in whatever way it does for them. And I think if it starts to have an impact, then it'll probably, like I said, we're probably just at the beginning. I'm a little nervous saying that, but here we go.
All right. Well, we wish you all the best. Good luck. Thanks again. Be good to each other. Be kind to each other. We'll see you all again soon on another episode of Mormon Stories Podcast. Take care, everybody.